The Ad Hoc Committee on Gang Violence and Youth Development will now come to order. We have one member present, so we'll commence as a subcommittee. We have one item on the agenda. If anybody wishes to speak on this item or on general public comment, please fill out a public comment card, which are on the desk in the back. You can give them to the clerk on the left of me, and we will call your name in the order of the items. With that, we'll begin with item number 1.
Item number 1, motion Alarcon Cardenas relative to requesting the city attorney to report on the Sanford complaint for a gang injunction and related matters.
Anybody want to come and speak to the committee on behalf of the police department, city attorney's office? You're in this together, I presume?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mind if I have a bottle of water up here? I'm just
please do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Chief Michael Moore with Operations Valley Bureau of LAPD. I'm joined by Captain George Villegas, Commanding Officer of Mission Area as well.
Good morning, sir. Bruce Reardon, the Director of Anti-Gang Operations for the City Attorney of Los Angeles.
Okay. All right. Who wants to go first? The question of the day is I guess they called it I called it a petition, but technically it's called a
application.
There's another funny word.
A complaint.
Yeah, complaint.
Complaint, yes.
Which kind of confuses the general public because when they think of a complaint, they think of like somebody complaining about something.
Yes, sir.
So this is basically a process in which the city attorney's office is asking of the courts to go ahead and solidify their effort to create a gang injunction surrounding the Sanford gang?
Yes, sir. It is a civil action, as I know the chairman is very well aware, but oftentimes the public isn't, and in fact, as per request from council member of District 7, we did participate last week, as did your deputy, Mr. Ewart, in a lengthy and very large community meeting in the Sylmar region of the city to talk about the process behind gang injunctions and the process of gang injunctions, and working with your staff, which we're very appreciative of the time that you and your staff have put into this, sir. We have some idea of questions that this ad hoc committee needs answered, and if I can cut to the chase, I will, and get right to those questions. There were some general areas that we were asked to testify about. The first was whether the safety zone in the proposed Sanford complaint is included in a current or proposed gang reduction development zone, the so-called GRZs that the mayor's office is working on as part of its gang youth and gang reduction strategy. I have 2 answers to that. First, embedded in that question was a second question about whether we work with or consult with the mayor's office when drawing up the boundaries of proposed gang injunctions. We do consult, we being the city attorney's office and the gang division, myself personally, consult on a regular basis with Deputy Mayor Alarcon for public safety. By regular basis, sometimes weekly, as to our general goals and proposed objectives. We are independent, of course, as I know the chairman is well aware. He does not provide work on or specific guidance with regard to our projects, nor do we with regard to his projects and the mayor's projects. However, we do keep him apprised of what we're doing, including the Sanford injunction, and how we're doing it. We provide him with materials and whatnot that is a backup for that sort of thing. And that's an ongoing basis. I think that relationship's getting better as we work together more, and we intend to keep it that way. But with regard to this particular safety zone, which I know the chair knows is the territory that, with regard to this particular safety zone, we believe there are several GRZs. The mission area GRZ is within that safety zone, and it may be that Captain Villegas can describe that for the chair.
I'm sorry. Describe.
The GRZ that's within the proposed safety zone.
Yeah, we came up with that as a recommendation in terms of the zone specific to the complaints that we're receiving from the community, as well as the crime statistics that provided to us over the course of several years. And basically, and more specifically, is that area is the area that we found has been claimed by the Sanford gang as being their territory, their piece of real estate that they own, and where in fact they attempt to dominate and control other aspects.
And I believe and my apologies, Mr. Chairman, I was speaking on another matter with Captain Villegas when Mr. Reardon was speaking to you. The question, I believe, is the gang reduction zone as to the targeted boundaries of the gang reduction zone or the safety zone. Yeah.
Is there a correlation between the two?
Let me go back to the gang reduction zones. I can speak probably better for the San Fernando Valley. The initial zone is, as you are aware, is in Pacoima. It is largely mirrors that of the clear zone that has been in existence for more than 10 years in the Pacoima area of the San Fernando Valley. The second identified gang reduction zone, as proposed by and is being implemented by the mayor's office, is in the Panorama City area of the San Fernando Valley. That is, however, that is a balancing act as to that second zone, because in reality, I have additional zones that could be used in the San Fernando Valley, in other areas of the San Fernando Valley that have I'll say similar gang challenges, similar gang problems. The mayor's office, in working with the police department, has been in a process of calculating the best areas in which to identify these zones, recognizing that they do not have the resources, as we do not have the resources as a city, to put gang reduction zones in the number of neighborhoods that truly have gang problems. So the Panorama City area, chosen as the second gang reduction zone for the San Fernando Valley, is a balancing act of where are the greatest concentrations of gang crimes. It is not to suggest to the San Fernando Valley that those are the only two areas that are in need of such a focused and intense effort on the prevention, intervention, and suppression side. The city is obviously well in play here, attempting to demonstrate that the gang reduction zone, the focus of specific resources in those targeted areas, can prove to be successful in reducing gang crime and gang membership, while at the same time pursuing a number of other existing and emerging strategies to still further impact gang crime and gang membership in other parts of the city. So the Sanford's gang injunction, for instance, is such a secondary effort. But its relationship, that safety zone, to the gang reduction zone, the second one being in the Panorama City, is that they are similar, but the intensity and the size of the area in the second zone has a number of gangs, including an existing injunction against Langdon Street, and so they're strategies that are similar, but they're not the same. Does that help to? Okay.
That helps us understand a little bit of the fact of the matter is the independence of the mayor's office and the independence of the city attorney's office and the independence of the police department, et cetera, and the fact that resources are allocated and efforts are commenced and are followed through based on the different philosophies and different distinct responsibilities of each one of those entities. The mayor being an administrative body, him and his team being an administrative body, the city attorney's office being the enforcement of laws and rights of citizens in the city. Yet the police department, your main charge is with the safety on the streets of the city of Los Angeles.
In our efforts,
misdemeanors, the interaction is that the city attorney's office will handle a case. Say you apprehend somebody and they committed a misdemeanor, what have you. The relationship with the city attorney's office is that they will go ahead and prosecute the case, et cetera.
And our efforts are to blend our collective energies so that these strategies are not at cross purposes, but that instead that they're amplified.
And I hope they complement each other.
Absolutely, I believe that they do.
All right. Now, one of the unique things about this particular potential gang injunction area proposed is that it is done on a geographic scale, on a per square mile scale that we haven't done in the city of Los Angeles in the past. Is that correct?
It's approximately the same size. It's one of the biggest. It's approximately the same size as the Avenues gang injunction, but those are the biggest in the city of Los Angeles. That is correct, sir.
Which one's bigger, the Avenues gang injunction or this one?
They're both about 9.5 square miles.
Okay.
So this may be marginally larger, but they're both large gang injunctions in terms of square miles.
And the Avenues gang injunction, when was that pursued or implemented?
That has now been in place for several years. I have a chart here.
I don't need to know the exact month, but I just want to know how many years it's been in existence.
It's been in existence since January 29, 2003.
For the permit.
For the permanent injunction, and the preliminary injunction went into effect a few months before that.
Okay.
There are other injunctions across the state that are large. Sometimes they're citywide, as in some smaller communities north of here and south of here. But for the city of LA, this is one of the two largest gang injunctions to square miles. And that was based, it was a question that came up frequently last week, sir, and the gang injunction was not based on a abstract design to make it large or small. It was based on the crime reporting. It's a process, and I know it would, I think, help the public to know that the process really began before my tenure in January of 2007. The process had began in 2006 with neighborhood reportings, crime reportings that come through LAPD. When I come on board, of course, met with Chief Moore and his gang command staff over a period of months, and with Marty Vranikar still in our office, and the determination was made that the crime stats were such for this particular gang over this broad stretch of territory that this gang injunction was one of the best tools to deal with this particular gang in this particular place.
Okay. Now, you're either confusing me or you're giving me two answers that are correct, but what I want to know, if these two answers are correct, which one supersedes the other? In one of your answers, you say that you decide the geographic boundary or area of this proposed gang injunction based on the crime statistics and the intensity, et cetera, and the kinds of crimes, et cetera. But yet at the same time, you said that, well, earlier, this is the area that the Sanfra gang claims.
It's both, really.
Yes.
So it just so happens that they're getting that good?
Well,
they claim an area, point to point, and then they cover that area that evenly?
Well, let me, if I might weigh in here. One of the challenges in this gang injunction has been recognizing the size of the safety zone necessary to be effective as using it as a tool. My tenure within the San Fernando Valley as either commander or as a deputy chief now extends some 6-7 years. And Sanford's is a multi-generational gang. It's a very large gang and has occupied and claimed as their turf the northern San Fernando Valley for decades. And their level of violence in this safety zone, as we spoke last week at the town hall, many people were amazed, but we've had 110 gang crimes in this safety zone since the beginning of the year in this area. The area is as to the safety zone, primarily it's a function of what is the area influenced by this gang, claimed by this gang, owned, asserted by this gang, as to rival gangs coming into that area. You have parallels such as Canoga Park, Alabama, Blythe Street, Langdon Street. When you look at those safety zones, those are the zones that are largely, that at the time the zones were designed, were largely influenced, owned, claimed, however you want to describe, asserted to be the territory of that resident gang. Mm-hmm. Sanford's, for years, we've had this as a very dominant gang in the northern San Fernando Valley. But one of the deterring factors was how do we formulate a safety zone, recognizing that right in the middle of it is the city of San Fernando. So it's cooperatively between enforcement arms, the city attorney's office, that being the misdemeanor arm of the city, because this is what gang injunctions are, in concert with the district attorney's office. So the complexions of this safety zone, the pursuit of this gang injunction, has been deterred, I will say, over the years, because, frankly, it's a pretty big nut to crack. getting prosecution teams, the city and district attorney to work together, getting the city of San Fernando and the city of Los Angeles, recognizing this is a strategy, in concert with the competition, Mr. Chairman, of other similar areas, smaller in size, but similar in intensity, that would also be deserving of a gang injunction. There are such areas in the San Fernando Valley. There are communities in the San Fernando Valley that are desirous of adding an injunction to their area.
Why don't we just get ahead of ourselves and start looking at the statistics?
We are.
And then also look at the claims of gangs, et cetera, and their activities, and then just start putting forth a list, and then having our anticipatory list of which are the gang injunctions that are coming next and next and next and next and next.
That is exactly the process in which...
actually in the process of doing
that process has been in place for years. LAPD, working with the city attorney's office, recognizing there is a limit of resources, has proposed a priority list, if you will, of gang injunctions. The city of Los Angeles has, from the San Fernando Valley, the city attorney's office has other gang injunctions proposed from the city from LAPD. This is not, nor do we just begin these processes on a singular path. There are a number of simultaneous acts. So this one's per se in the hopper or before the court. Behind this are other proposed gang injunctions in the San Fernando Valley as a tool to suppress gang violence. So what we generally do not do is talk in a public manner to the community as to we'll talk in generalities in response to community outcry asking for gang injunctions. That's a strategy in which LAPD, working the city attorney's office, working with the court, will pursue as an effective means of impacting gang violence, as an effective means of deterring the public display of gangs. But Mr. Councilman, if I might just finish, what we will not do is say this week or this month we're going to start serving gang members with a notice to appear. The reason for that is gang members will avoid service. And so what will happen is, as a general strategy, we talk about the development of gang injunctions. But once the gang injunction is going to actually be presented before the court, we will have a quiet time, much like a stock or a company is quiet about their financial results. We'll have a quiet time just before the announcement of that injunction as an effort so that we can effectively serve gang members, to put them on notice so that they can defend themselves and represent their side of the story to the court. So in summary, this gang injunction was chosen as a combination of balancing the needs of the community, the desires of the community, in concert with the intensity of the gang crime, the nature of the gang itself, the size of the zone, and what are the competing areas in the San Fernando Valley and, by extension, the city of Los Angeles for similar enforcement efforts via a gang injunction. And this finally got to the top of the list. And that's why we're at this stage.
Okay. Did you just allude to the idea that part of what came into play on this particular gang injunction request was members of the community asking for a gang injunction?
Yes.
So there was actually some talk coming out from the community saying, why don't you put a gang injunction around here? Things are getting so bad, whatever it is they communicate with you. But the words gang injunction came to what, the police department, or mainly to the city attorney's office, or to who?
To neighborhood meetings involving the police department, involving neighborhood prosecutors, involving all members of city government, including council districts and others. There are people who are in the community who are desirous of a gang injunction being in their neighborhood. What I'd like to do is, and I have attended those meetings. I have been at those town halls myself through the years. But I'd also like to transition that to this testimony to Captain Villegas, who is, as you know and aware, as an area captain, is much more involved in those day-to-day meetings with the individual communities. Captain Villegas.
You may recall in 2006 we had a gang increase statistically of about 165% up in the northeast San Fernando Valley, specifically in the Mission area.
Increase in activity or increase in numbers of gang members?
Gang crime that was reported, arrests that were made of gang members. So our gang crime increased about 165% that particular year. In an effort to address some of those community community concerns that were coming in terms of telephone calls, we had a series of meetings with block captains, neighborhood watch groups. There was a town hall meeting that was held in Sylmar on a Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon. And during the course of all of these meetings, gang suppression, gang enforcement, gang injunctions were the issues that were discussed, and the community was specifically requesting that we did something to create a zone, their words, zones, injunctions, if you will, to address gang crime, similar to what was occurring in other parts of the city. We do have some community members that are quite sophisticated and participate in city government such that they know the programs that are occurring throughout the city. So it was something that was brought up, and it was something that was discussed. So we've had these discussions with the community for several years now.
Yes, sir. If I may add to that, in my relatively recent tenure, for example, I think it was Captain Villegas who is routinely at all these meetings. We've had meetings with either neighborhood prosecutors or gang prosecutors, or even myself. For example, in one community in the Valley last year, Valley Village, where the community was the only topic on the list was, do we need a gang injunction in Valley Village? Can we get one? And after a roughly 2 to 3 hour meeting with myself, various members of the LAPD, other prosecutors, community leaders, the sense of the meeting was strongly, no, we don't. But that was their question. And
But wait a minute. What begs the question now is, who determines the impetus for a gang injunction? Is it the community, or is it the statistics and the fact that the police department's able to verify, and also the city attorney correspond and say there's a lot of gang activity here and there's a gang claim going on here?
And if I might weigh in on that, this is not a simple yes/no. This is not a yes. The essence. I talked earlier about prioritization. We talked about the level of gang activity. Talked about its concentration, the history of the gang. One of the major factors is, how does this gang's behavior, how is it relative to ground, to territory? There are gangs that are mobile, that move and without regard to a particular neighborhood. A motorcycle gang, criminal motorcycle gang is a prime example. Motorcycle gangs, they connect a criminal enterprise, narcotic trade, weapon trade, violence against one another with little regard to the community. There are some neighborhoods that they might claim, but generally they claim their differences between the Hells Angels and the Vagos are not in regards to a neighborhood. Gangs criminal street gangs that we're talking about here today, particularly Sanford's, has some attributes of a criminal street gang in the sense of a motorcycle gang, in that they do transport narcotics. They are a major enforcement arm of MA, and they manifest themselves in gang crime, violence, not always with a direct correlation to territory. There are other gangs that are directly related to a territory, directly related to a neighborhood. They do not extend beyond those borders. Blythe Street is a good example. They may venture into rival gang territories to commit gang acts of violence, but their primary function is to try to exert control and authority over a neighborhood. Sanford's has, as a matter of their stated existence, claimed the safety zone. That when you ask a Sanford where their hood is, they will assert, this is it. We had testimony last week in the town hall of a former Sanford gang member who stepped up and said, if we're not here, we worry about who will be here. The essence of the argument was, this gang injunction should not go forward, because if you're effective against Sanford's as gang members loitering and committing violations of this gang injunction, other gang members are going to backfill this, and they're going to assert control. So it's either us, the devil you know, or the devil you don't. And so
is this injunction against all identified gang members who traverse through this territory, or only the identified Sanford gang members?
The latter. Only identified, specifically identified.
So with all due respect, Chief, you just identified a major loophole and flaw in law enforcement for this community.
I disagree.
Well, hold on a second. If you have a gang injunction in this area, and an officer who happens to work that beat, Villegas happens to keep somebody there a long time, I wish the department would do that more often, especially in tough neighborhoods, so people can, know the neighborhood and know who's who and all that. And then all of a sudden they say, you know what, there goes, hold on, I got some names and faces here. There goes Scrappy, who's his AK, Albert J. Alcala, and Michael Altamirano, otherwise known as Solo, in a Camaro going down Glen Oaks, and Polk going down Glen Oaks. And he says, hey man, those are two known Sanford gang members associating with each other in a car. First of all, is that enough to pull them over?
Once they've been served on the injunction?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. So the officer pulls those two guys over. What other tools does the officer have in that scenario, that pulling over of that vehicle, that he otherwise wouldn't have if this injunction hadn't been served on those individuals?
Prior to in the absence of this injunction, he would not have the ability to conduct that stop absent some other lawful reasonable suspicion. The person would have to commit a traffic violation. Mm-hmm. The person would have to be otherwise involved in some type of suspected criminal activity.
Because that's a basic right that everybody has in this country, right?
Including gang members.
Including gang members, yes.
Absolutely. And yet, if they're named on the injunction, and they are gang members that have been identified, have been properly served, and notified as to the order of the court, as to that they shall not associate one with the other in this safety zone in public places, and there are some exceptions to this, then the officer would be allowed to, just on the witnessing of this action, it's a misdemeanor committed in their presence, conduct a stop and make an arrest. And that is to those identified, served Sanford gang members. The issue here is, when you talked earlier, Mr. Councilman, as to the issue of a flaw in this, one of the recognized implications of this gang injunction is that other gangs may view this as a weakening of that gang's control over that area, and they will attempt to assert authority, including acts of violence or presenting themselves for narcotic sales and engaging in the criminal enterprise that heretofore the resident gang was doing. We've seen that and I have seen that in the Valley in each of the areas in which we have gang injunctions imposed. The department is not naive to that, nor is the area in which these gang injunctions are in place. This is not meant to suggest to you that the injunction itself is flawed or that it's fatal. It's a fatal flaw. Just as we're not suggesting here today that this is an injunction is a save-all, that an area will be indemnified by the existence of such an injunction. I wish gang crime was that simple.
Right. If I may, Council Member, that what you've identified, and I know you know this well, is that it is an inherent part of fighting gang crime, the predatory nature of gangs, whether it was the Rolling 60s cases I worked on many, many years ago in the 90s, or 18th Street cases from the late 90s, or even with the Sanford gang. Whenever any law enforcement action, be it a big RICO case or a homicide action or a gang injunction, if you will, is taken against one particular gang, there is always the sense among law enforcement, prosecutors, and everyone else who is familiar with this process that other gangs in the neighborhood, or gangs that are border the territory, or are rivals for that gang historically, may seek, through their predatory nature, to take that territory over. I have to say, in the last year and a half, I'm well aware that LAPD's command staff and their gang command staff specifically is aware of that problem and prepare themselves for it. But it is an existing problem.
Hold on. You walked us through the logic of the action and reaction of other gangs when a gang injunction is imposed on a particular named gang, like the Sanford in this case. But I want to hear from you. You used the word perceived in the city attorney's office, that those are perceived problems. But I want to know, have there been actions and reactions in these communities where gangs are in fact moving in, as you pointed out, Chief Moore, that there's a perception of a weakness in that area. In this case, it would be a Sanford gang. Have you witnessed in other areas in the Valley, since that's your area, Chief Moore, that other gangs are using that as their tool to say, hey man, we now can go in there because they're not going to be in 2s and 3s. If we run into a gang member at Blythe, because there's an injunction there, unless they're crazy enough to get pulled over by the cops every 5 minutes, they're not going to be hanging out in groups. So now we can go over there, our group can go in there and wreak havoc or commit some crimes, or what have you. You understand what I'm getting at?
Clearly.
Does that activity ensue? Is there evidence of that kind of activity in the past?
Unequivocally, yes.
Okay.
Just as when we go out and make an arrest of a shot caller in a gang, we take down a gang and its leadership significantly. There is turmoil in that gang as they reestablish themselves, including acts of violence within the gang. That is clearly seen in countless times where we'll have a major impact on a significant and violent gang. And as we have that impact, we will then witness acts of other gangs trying to assert control over the territory because they believe there's a perceived weakness. This is not a terribly complex matter. We're seeing this right now in Mexico with the drug lords as they're warring with each other and the Mexican government as the Mexican government is trying to establish control and suppress the drug trafficking and the gang violence that is occurring there. This is a gang crime in the city of Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley are microcosms, are small examples of this problem that grows in size and enormity across this country and is international.
May I add, sir?
Hold on one second. On that note, so you mentioned the scenario of taking out a shot caller.
Yes.
In other words, effectively apprehending somebody and successfully taking them off the streets and they're a shot caller. In other words, a shot caller is another way of saying that's a leader in a gang.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it sounds to me an example of a specific, more of a surgical pinpoint activity where you get a specific result that is actually a positive result. Because taking a leader out of a gang and taking them off the streets hopefully will hopefully reduce crime, hopefully improve the situation for that neighborhood.
Well, I will say that as you claim it as a positive, I claim it as a positive. However, I've had and we have debates as that we must recognize that when we are effective against a criminal enterprise, whether this is organized crime from the romanticism that Hollywood gives it, or it is simple street violence between gang members, that when you remove powerful players or influential players, you create a vacuum, and that vacuum is oftentimes filled with violence. We recognize that. We know that occurs. That does not deter us from going out and arresting those violent offenders for fear that other people are going to step up.
Nor would I want to make it clear, especially since the press is listening, I'm not encouraging anybody or deter anybody from taking out shot callers or what have you and doing that specific job. But you just described something that's more surgical and direct, yet a gang injunction to me sounds much more broad.
Well, I would disagree.
So it's a broad tool.
I would disagree because every person, it is surgical in this. The San Fernando Valley and the safety zone within the San Fernando Valley is 9.5 square miles. The San Fernando Valley is 222 square miles. This is a subset of the San Fernando Valley for this particular injunction. So therefore, just by the territory itself, it's not a generalized, we're not boiling the ocean here. We're talking about a specific community, number one. Number two, we're not talking about criminalizing everyone in that community. Because frankly, the vast majority, 99.5% or more of those people well beyond that stat are law-abiding, safe, community-building individuals that deserve safety, they deserve the right to exist, they deserve not to have the violence of this gang. We are targeting specifically named individuals who are admitted gang members. These are not John Does in the sense of, if I see you, you're male, you're dressed down, you look like the gang member, therefore you're now subject to this injunction. We do not do that. And there are people who would argue that we would. I would encourage anyone to read the tenets of this injunction, and as well as to recognize that in LAPD we are a learning organization, and to the extent that this has ever been practiced by an officer, such a reckless act, we take corrective action, which includes not only recognizing that you shall not just go out and wantonly enforce a gang injunction against unknown individuals, number one. Number two is that the training and oversight of this gang injunction is it will only be against specific individuals who have been named, identified. The criteria is clearly written, reviewed by the city attorney's office, and affirmed, and will will be supervised by the court. So this is not just a willy-nilly offense.
So once a gang injunction is commenced, and say you have, how many names in this case?
Well, this gang injunction actually names the gang, and then individuals are identified. The gang is named as the defendant. Individuals are then identified within the gang injunction. But what is required before we charge a case is that LAPD has served an individual. So if the gang has roughly 700 to 900 members, those 700 to 900 members through this process, as well as the process of the court and public community meetings, and then, of course, service of the injunction, are notified that the injunction exists. Then, unless you are served with when the preliminary injunction is granted, if it is granted by the courts, LAPD serves individuals. Only that subset of individuals. It depends on their determination as to which individuals are most needful of service, if it's 50, if it's 100, whatever the number is.
Who comes up with the names to be members of that subset that you just described?
That's the LAPD working with our gang prosecutors.
I would argue that the gang members themselves come up with their names.
But they don't offer their names.
But no, but
So somebody writes their name down and it becomes the formal name on that formal list, right?
Yes, and the process of that is as follows. Crimes that are investigated by the department, that are identified by victims, shootings, including various acts of violence, that as the department investigates, it identifies suspects, some of those suspects of which you've identified here, that have been arrested. In the process of our interactions with this individual, the person claims to be a gang member, a Sanford gang member, provides a moniker, demonstrates evidence of their involvement in the gang. That person, through their conduct, because of the overarching conduct of the Sanford gang and its influence in that neighborhood, is going to become an applicant, if you will, for inclusion on this gang injunction. The consequence of that, Mr. Chairman, is that now this person is going to be prohibited from associating with other known Sanford gang members in this area. And if they want to avoid that, they stay out of the safety zone. They stay out of the territory. Because there are gang members who will never leave this particular gang, or any gang for that matter. But they belong to a gang, and they'll say, you know something, I'm never going to disown Sanford's. Well, then move away from the neighborhood. Give the neighborhood its ability to exist without the disorder and the violence that your gang is bringing to this neighborhood. That's one way for them to avoid the consequences of this gang injunction. The second way is for them to walk away from this gang, to say I'm no longer a member, and to stay inactive, or to walk away from a lifestyle of criminality, from committing acts of violence, from stealing and committing property crimes. And as they make that application to the city attorney's office will review the merits of that assertion. I have gang members who have told me personally, I haven't been active. I'm clean. I've been clean for years. I'll go run their rap sheet, and I was arrested last year. Well, yeah, but that was just a minor matter. Well, actually, I have that. The police tried to stop you, and there was a pursuit. Well, yeah, but I was afraid what was going to happen to me. Well, I'm sorry. Just a moment ago, you're a criminal. You're a gang member that's been inactive, and you've walked away from this lifestyle. But I show that you were arrested last year.
Even more, if I may, I've seen in the last 15 years the very typical. Probably interviewed at least 1,000 gang members in the course of being a federal investigator. A very typical response from gang members is, "I'm not involved in the gang violence. And I still deal drugs. I still do some things. I earn some money, but I'm not part of the violence." And of course, as I know this council member is well aware and polices his district very closely on this, that's pretty serious criminal activity, and it's still gang activity if the drugs are being controlled by the gang. If I can just pick up on 3 points, I hope they'll be helpful. First, with regard to Sanford gang, in attempting to target large, powerful gangs such as Sanford, 18th Street, other gangs like MS 13, those are gangs that also have historical associations with the MA. That association provides them an authority on the street that scares other gangs away. These are gangs that actually scare other gangs. Those gangs, therefore, have an additional power that is their association with the prison gang known as the MA. And that keeps, MA actually polices other cliques because they want the profits to come from the cliques that they are associated with. That's something we're also aware of, and we work with the federal authorities on that because the federal authorities are really in the best position to pursue RICO-style actions against, as I have done in the past, against members of the Mexican Mafia who were controlling 18th Street, for example, in the Westlake area. In those cases, they were surgical, but they were not single defendant cases. There were 26, 36, sometimes as many as 50 or 60 people were charged. Recently in the F-13, or Florencia 13 case, a case I was not involved in, over 100 members of the gang were charged. They are big sweeps, but they are relatively surgical. Absolutely, it's a fair description. The idea is to take as many of the shot caller and the shot caller's lieutenants off the street, where the evidence allows, to create some space so that, particularly, and the local police are really they're the people who do the hard work on this. The local police, the LAPD, can come in and police the area on the street. That said, I think that gang injunctions, while broader than a 5 or 6 defendant case or even a 20 defendant case, are still tailored, very much so. That's the word I would use. I'm not trying to bandy words, but that's the word I've come to believe, that gang injunctions, we seek to tailor them. And in fact, sir, the courts want us to do that too. The Superior Court judges are by no means rubber stamps. They're actively involved in these gang injunctions. They read all the papers. They review every word of the proposed orders to make sure the evidence is there. And in this case, we've provided 130 declarations of specific testimony and then 2 additional gang expert declarations that are very extensive. We've provided those in court. Those are public filings, and we could provide those to the council if you so desire. And they lay out a more than 1 year or several year history of Sanford gang incidents. And the idea is to demonstrate through the evidence that this is a nuisance that needs to be dealt with in order so that, and you're absolutely right, that the rights of gang members will be restricted if we can prove that nuisance exists and it's ordered in court, and that the argument is and that the rights of other people, the victims of the gang members, the other community members, the 85, 90, 95% of the community that have no relationship to the gang, besides being intimidated by them, their rights can then blossom and prosper. That's the basic concept. And if I may add one last thing just to clean up one other point. In both Sherman Oaks and Valley Village community meetings, Sherman Oaks as well, that I attended last year, where gang injunctions were discussed, the question that was largely asked, and maybe I was confusing, was, can we get a gang injunction to keep gang members out, a stay away? That doesn't exist. And once it was explained, but sometimes takes an hour to 2 to 3 to explain the legal underpinnings for that, that's when the community realizes, I see, there's a problem with gangs. We're afraid gangs will come into our community, but that's a policing mechanism. There's no mechanism for stay away from our community. With the Sanford's gang, they're in that community, and that's why we're seeking the injunction. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of any gangs being in Valley Village or claiming Valley Village yet, but...
Well, there was, I was at the town hall with Councilwoman Gruhl. It was March of last year. There was a significant shooting, attempt murder that occurred. It was between, involved at least one tagging group, and that was a community within the San Fernando Valley that was very concerned. It was right outside of Grant High School, and they see discussions regarding injunctions, and they wanted to know why they couldn't do this. Now, the department, when we talk about the profile or how do we come about determining an injunction, there is a diagnostics. There's a certain amount of assessment that goes on. And the limit of the gang injunction is it's influencing conduct of individuals to territory, to ground. It does not influence the conduct of those individuals outside of that safety zone. So we have to have not only specific gang members, but we have to have behavior by them that is related to a specific neighborhood or territory. And in Sanford's, we do. The challenge has been, and the delay in my mind, of why this is only now reached the priority that it has, is because we had the complications of the size of the safety zone in concert with the city of San Fernando. So we had 2 municipalities, a different prosecuting office, and we had competing initiatives, gang injunctions. If you look, and as we look over the last 2 or 3 years at other injunctions that have come up, they have been of a similar or greater intensity as to the level of violence on the street. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, this is an application of a tool that has to be, we have to acknowledge, is somewhat limited by the amount of resources that we have. Because then finally, as we put an injunction in place, we need to enforce it. We need to enforce it. If we allow gang members that are named and identified and served on this injunction to exist in this safety zone in violation of this order and do not challenge that or take action against it, the injunction itself becomes void.
And
So when a gang injunction is commenced, like the one you mentioned, the Avenues injunction, basically formalized and commenced in January of 2003, there was a list, whatever number of names were on that list. Did that list stay stagnant? Is that list fluid? Do names get added? Do names get taken off? I mean,
it is fluid, sir. Now with the naming of the gang and the gang as the defendant, practice that's been upheld by the California courts, the gang is fluid, as I know the council member's question is well aware. It's fluid for a variety of reasons. It's fluid because, sadly, I know the council member has put enormous amount of his time into this effort. A youth at risk joined the gang for a variety of reasons, and that's something that no one has found the answer to stopping yet on the prevention and intervention side, but which we support any effort that can be made on that, because that is
so names do get added to the list as time goes on.
People are served.
Right?
Rather than names added to the list, people are served as time. It is organic. Because it is fluid.
And this is not a sunset type of scenario. This is not, well, the gang injunction will commence in January of 2003 and it will be taken off 5 years later in January 2008. It's not a sunset issue. It's a matter of the need and the case was made, and until the activity and or the results bear out, then a gang injunction doesn't go away until someday when somebody says, like, the police officer of that area.
Let me try to clarify that.
And or the city attorney says, hey, man, there's nothing going on there anymore.
Name suspects, name gang members that die as a result of gang violence. They cease to, their name may still be on the injunction, but they're ceased to have any enforcement efforts. Gang members who are listed on that injunction, move out of the area. They move to other parts of the country.
But their name stays on the list.
Their name stays on the injunction. They may apply online or in person with the city attorney's office and say, I've moved to Arkansas and I've listed on this gang injunction. I'm not in the safety zone. I have no intention of going back to the safety zone. I'm not a member of the Sanford gang any longer. They can apply to be removed from that injunction. They may also be unwilling to say, I'm not a member of the Sanford gang. They may be starting someplace else.
They leave and never look back.
Either way, and they may
verbally or otherwise. But the thing is, so I just want to establish that when injunction is commenced, a certain number of names are vetted and put on the list formally. Correct?
Not on the actual gang injunction, but a certain number of names are. The gang injunction remains against the gang, but a certain number of names are vetted and served, and that then list that record is kept.
What's the process of adding a name to that list?
That process starts with, again, activity on the street that LAPD reports to our gang prosecutor. It says we have an individual who needs to be served with this gang injunction, and our gang prosecutor has interaction. It either happens in one of two ways. Either a gang prosecutor beforehand is consulted with regard to the individual and approves the service, go ahead, serve the individual, we'll add that individual to the list, or if it was an opportunity that arises, an exigency, where an officer sees someone that they had known about, had a history with, serves that individual, then they have to afterwards come to our prosecutor and say, I have served this individual, and then there's a process back and forth, whether there's evidence, how do you know he's a gang member, what are you basing that on, and that is how the list grows. It doesn't grow dramatically.
Now, what you just described doesn't involve a judge anymore.
That part does not. Service does not involve the judge.
Oh,
because
okay.
the service
so even
is not
in the
a crime.
commencement, the service, the names of individuals does not involve a judge. Just the injunction in and of itself of that gang and that geographic area is scrutinized by the judge.
The two processes that are scrutinized by the judges most closely are the granting of the injunction, which we're now going through that process, and then that's the civil action. That's the civil complaint, and as you point out, is perhaps not a perfectly titled document, but that's the civil terminology they use in civil court. That's the civil complaint suing the gang, if you will. That part is supervised by a court, and that supervised is maintained by the court. The court maintains that docket, not that different than for example, any other injunction or any other consent decree. Second part of it is the criminal aspect. On a case-by-case basis, if an individual is arrested in violation of the gang injunction, I also would note, I think it's of value, that routinely, at least in our jurisdiction, and I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but in our jurisdiction, a gang injunction violation often is in connection with some other violation of the law, be it a driving violation or a public violation such as noise or creating a disturbance, graffiti, some other violation. Narcotic sales, possession of a weapon, those are oftentimes packaged together, and that comes to our office. That's a criminal case. If we, upon review it, and sometimes upon review, we don't proceed with the case. But if upon our review there's substantial evidence to go forward that we can have admitted in court and prove our case, prove that the individual is a gang member, prove that he was served, and prove that he actually committed the crimes alleged. That goes to court. That's the criminal court, and that's supervised by individual criminal judges. And in that instance, of course, the individual also has all the rights, the due process rights attached.
But the adding of the name,
The service.
and then to serve, and then determine that that person should be served and added to the list of names on that particular injunction. That's done internally.
The service is done by our offices together. It is not monitored by a judge. The actual service is not
And
monitored.
that's usually commenced by an officer saying, you know, this guy is so-and-so, he has an AKA, you know, he's...
The department's use of how we identify a gang member is consistent with the California state standards as to the criteria of an identified gang member. One of which is, I believe it's, there's 5 conditions of which the person falls within either 2 or 3 of those. And forgive me, I don't have the exact criteria on my mind right now. But one of the criteria is an admitted gang member. Another one is tattoos, markings. It can be clothing, such as the use of certain colors, certain baseball caps, for instance, with a letter on the top of it. There are or football teams per se. Sports apparel is adopted by gang members as a means of flying colors. Certain teams, if you wear a certain team of a baseball cap in certain parts of the San Fernando Valley, you can provoke an assault, a gang violence against you, because that is a baseball cap or emblem or symbol that, as you know, is claimed by that gang, and they'll initiate violence just for merely the disrespect of someone wearing that item on their hood.
So there's 5 elements.
Yes, and we'll be happy to provide you.
3 of the 5 apply to a person before it said, you know what, that's enough to say this person should be added to the list.
It's a combination thereof. It's not necessarily 3. It's a combination thereof. It's the criminal activity that they're involved in. It's the area that they're in.
Who they're associating
with, how they're dressed. Is there any admission? Is there not an admission? Is there a visible evidence of the gang association or the gang membership? What the chief talked about, and tattoos that they're using, is the people that they're associating with. What's their admission? What are they saying? How are they? What's the relationship with the people that they're with in connection to what activity they're involved in? So it's a combination of factors.
To give an example, a 14-year-old admitted Sanford gang member associating with his 16-year-old brother at a park would not make that 16-year-old brother a gang member.
Correct.
Unless
the 16-year-old gang member...
He was dressed a certain way or had a particular football jersey on.
If the 16-year-old gang member said, or the 16-year-old brother said, yes, I'm a Sanford gang member as well, the 16-year-old gang brother were to have a tattoo of Sanford on his person, or wear clothing indicative to or claimed by the Sanford gang as their attire, if you would. The individual, however, in the wobbler, if you will, which is the question is this just simply a brother hanging out with his brother at a park playing a game of pickup ball? Is the officers don't paint the territory red. They're not going to walk up to that person and ordain that person as a gang member and then put them in the injunction. We have neither the time nor the temperament to do that. And the supervision, both internally within LAPD as well as by the city attorney's office, is that we not just include everyone by association. However, repeated instances where this individual, let me change the fact pattern, and make this individual holding a handgun in his waistband, associating with his 14-year-old brother at the park at hours of 11 o'clock at night with 3 or 4 other Sanford gang members. This 16-year-old brother is then to say, I'm not a Sanford gang member. What are you doing? I'm just hanging out here, and they asked me to hold a gun, so therefore I am. Well, the department is not going to look at that with an innocence or a naivete and say, well, no, the person's probably not a gang member. We would identify the person as an associate at that point and may, depending on other person's testimony, including his brother, yeah, he's a Sanford. He goes by the name of Chewy or Tom or Smith or Mike. I mean, we will look at the totality of the circumstances and the criminality, the actions of this suspect, and determine whether or not the injunction is a suitable tool to use to control and manage their conduct in the effort to, again, restore peace in that community.
And if I may, Council Member, just to add to that, it is an evolution, and the process has evolved even in the time I've been here. And part of that evolution is us working together as a team, including the ad hoc committee's questions that you've been asking for the time I've been here and beyond. And the way it evolves is to be as tailored and focused as possible, to avoid overbroad service. It doesn't do anyone any good. Those cases are not going to be charged by our office. They're going to result in a resource drain that's not focused, it's not effective, and it doesn't do the community any good. I have to say that in repeated meetings with the LAPD command staff and their gang units, they are well aware of that mission. The mission is to focus on those individuals, be they 200 in some gangs, such as the Columbia Little Psychos in Westlake, be they 700 or more, such as the Sanford gang, those individuals who are members of the gang, and this is a very important and, we can prove it in court. Can't just be a hunch, can't be a, I got a feeling. It's because that's not admissible evidence anyways, and no judge, as you know, is going to allow that in. It's got to be, no, I have a basis in fact for this. I can testify to field interviews. I can testify to my personal experience. And the bulk of our work, sir, in the gang division is with the gang patrol, the gang officers, the gang detectives of the LAPD, the vast bulk of our work. And they have a very specified knowledge of, that's what they do all the time, 24/7. And then one last point, there is, however, an important aspect that, and we thank the council members for supporting our need to have the resources to do this. We have the resources, and Mr. Delgadillo has given us the resources to make sure we have prosecutors to help in the training, the constant training of officers as new officers come in. And I don't mean that as any form of insult. We do training ourselves on a regular rotating basis.
Now,
we all need it.
Training gang officers or training new officers to PD in certain neighborhoods across the board?
They're both. The department's initiative with this is not just the subject matter experts, that being the gang officers themselves, but our patrol officers, supervisors, working in the areas, detectives. What is the purpose of the gang injunction? What its criteria is? What is necessary or needed to include a person? And then how is it used? Let me just talk just briefly that this injunction, we've talked very. We have a tendency at times as we start talking about these matters as if to believe the whole world is about, and gang enforcement is about this injunction. This is a tool on, as you know, on a this is, our work, we like to think on involving gangs is, as represented by San Fernando Valley Coalition on Gangs. It's intervention, it's prevention, and it's suppression. This is a subset of a subset of an initiative that is, that I believe is going to prove effective in the San Fernando Valley to the Sylmar community. However, I also believe it's going to allow intervention and prevention services to a greater opportunity to be successful. It's going to go against targeted gang members, some of which will argue that they're not gang members, which I welcome that argument because I'm looking to find a way for them to be true. There may be those that would represent it for the selfish purpose of just being unlisted so they can go about their way and continue to assert their authority and influence in that community. But there will be those that will be interested, or there will be parents that will be interested if once their 16-year-old child is listed as a gang member on this injunction, that they'll be interested. That'll be the final straw to move against and move with services to move that child out of that lifestyle. A 15-year-old boy was shot a week ago Thursday with a shotgun because of his gang membership.
Association.
is this the gang injunction is an enforcement tool, but it's also an opportunity for suppression, yes, but also for intervention. There is an opportunity here for people who are listed on it to find a way to use this as the most recent means of redirecting their activities away from the gang.
So just last week, a 15-year-old
Week ago Thursday.
in that geographic area, the Sanford gang injunction area, was shot with a shotgun.
Yes.
Was he named yet?
Well, we don't pursue juveniles at the city attorney's office. I don't believe he was part of it.
Wrong
So
question.
juveniles are not on the list?
Yes, hold on. Wrong question. The answer to the question is we don't have an injunction yet. So there is no one named on it.
There's no names yet.
Correct.
That's correct.
There's a list of names, but that list has not been vetted finally to be brought forward as the official list.
You have declarations, I believe, that name individuals and their criminality
Correct.
as members of the Sanford gang.
Yeah.
Once the injunction is found to have the court finds that it merits and issues the order, then the obligation upon the police department working with the city attorney's office is to, and working with the city of San Fernando, is to, as we identify Sanford gang members, is to serve them with this order. This individual, so that is yet not in place.
But wait a minute. See, the thing is, you actually touched on something that is very important to the community, and that is there's gang associated and there's gang member. Because Mr. Villegas, you clarified that the 15-year-old that was shot with a shotgun was actually gang associated.
Correct.
Or if,
Generally, before you become a gang member, you don't wake up one morning and you're 15 years old and say, I want to be a gang member. Let me go to the local recruiting station and get jumped into the gang. It's a process that occurs over some time. There's some recruiting that occurs. It's your friendships. It's your associations. And there are many cases, many cases where we have people that associate with gang members don't necessarily become gang members. And there is that distinction, and that is an important distinction. It's a distinction for us, and it's a distinction for them as well.
Very important distinction, sir.
give me just at least one example, because you've all acknowledged in the city attorney's offices and the police department that there's an important distinction.
Correct.
But with all due respect, your average Angelino thinks you look like a gang, you act like a gang member, you look like a gang member, you act like a gang member. Yet we have somebody from the police department who has, you run an entire precinct yourself, and you're saying, whoa, wait a minute. To us, the police department, there's a distinction. Give me one example of why there is a distinction and an example of the importance between the difference.
Well, to give you an example, and just Selmar High School.
Okay.
It's in the zone. It buses some of the students into the school. Fair, and they come from different parts of the city. He may have a person in his classroom or his class or a football team, and that is a gang member, that is a Sanford gang member, as an example, and he may associate with them on a regular basis. But he has not been jumped in. He has not necessarily claimed that he is a Sanford gang member. He's not committing crimes in association with and in coordination with this Sanford gang member. So that could be a person who is consistently associating with the Sanford gang members whenever law enforcement takes any type of law enforcement action and comes in contact with him. So if we come in contact with him because of a radio call that was generated by the community, and in response, we are conducting our investigation, our field investigation, and we find this one person who says, nope, not a gang member, doesn't have all the identifying characteristics of a gang member, but he is consistently with the Sanford gang, then he is an associate of the Sanford gang. And there is that distinction. The importance for us is that we are able to identify that there is a person or persons that are associating with them. We can identify cliques. We can identify their relationships within that particular gang. That person may never graduate to the level of becoming a gang member. Now, there are others.
And for the city attorney's office, an example of the importance of that distinction?
If I may give two answers to that question. The first answer is it's an important distinction. Of course, there's a gray area in the middle that it's fact-based, evidence-based, case-by-case. That's I know that this council well knows that our work often breaks down to specific facts and specific cases that are hard to generalize. That said, that's the fundamental principle. But what we do in the city of LA, and this is under Chief Bratton as well as Mr. Delgadillo's specific policies, and I believe these are policies that are well endorsed by this committee and the council and the mayor, we pursue as tailored an approach to gang injunctions as we can under the law, and other jurisdictions do this. The law allows us to, we do not need to require service. Service is not a legal requirement before an element of the crime. Notice is. And many jurisdictions pursue a much broader approach to gang injunction violations. You've been notified by, for instance, a public committee meeting by posting, by the fact that other gang members know. We see these cases all the time from other jurisdictions. Hey, if your gang leader has been served, you've been served. It's sort of a ipso facto type analysis. But in this jurisdiction, under our policies, and we believe they're the best policies, that's why we follow them, we insist on service. So that is a really critical distinction to narrow and tailor our focus. With association, we've seen two types of things. Over the years, of course, they go back so many years now with this. For me, with Rolling 60s, for example, for 5 years I spent investigating the Rolling 60s of my life. It was a constant matter of policing the cases to, and I believe this is something that's across the board true. The mission was, if the Rolling 60s truly are an organized gang that are causing a huge problem in South LA, then we need to identify those members of the gang. If they are committing crimes and there's evidence that supports that, then to proceed forward. Invariably, there are individuals who associate with the gang, sometimes for reasons such as that may just be, I want to hang out. Well, we don't want to prosecute those individuals. If they do commit another crime, such as selling drugs, that was typically. A case would often be brought to you, many, many cases. This individual sold drugs to an undercover officer, and he associates with the Rolling 60s. Or, to put it another way, he sells drugs to the Rolling 60s. That's an associate, would be my position as an assistant U.S. attorney. It's still our position under the policies of the city attorney. That is someone who associates with the gang. And one of the ways to find out who's in the gang, frankly, it's the same work I know this council does on a daily basis. It's just legwork, hard work, talk to people. Actually, you probably would not be amazed, sir, because I know that you really have worked deeply in this area. But I think the public would be amazed how much gang members will tell you if you ask them. They will go on. They want to tell their story, and they'll tell you who's in the gang, and they'll tell you who's not. That still has to be corroborated. Very important that if someone says so-and-so is in the gang, it has to be corroborated, because they might have a beef with that individual, or they might be lying, or they might be wrong. And that's all just hard legwork, case-by-case basis.
Well, I would think, and Councilmember Alarcon has a question, but I would think that if any Angelinos are listening to this conversation, quite a few Angelinos would be pretty upset that the police department and city attorney's office actually makes a distinction between an associate, somebody who associates with a gang, and somebody who's a gang member. Because, well, like I said earlier, they'd rather you just broad brush and say, that's a gang member.
Well, if I might respond, I'm
not asking you to call them gang members.
Oh, no, I'm not. And I'm not
saying. I understand the mindset, because I get those complaints when I'm out in the community, and then one step further, they say, I made a comment that we're talking in a community about the tagging going on, and that my staff and the police department have been looking at it and taking photos, and they've determined that they keep hitting this wall, and those are taggers. Person got very upset and started yelling at me, saying that that's a gang member. And I wasn't arguing with the person, but I was going based on what the police department tells me, and I think that the police department's correct in saying there's a difference between a tagger and a gang member.
Correct.
Right? Even though they might be, one of their activities looks one and the same to an untrained eye in the community, a person who writes on a wall with a spray can is a gang member, is what some community members might think. But a police officer says, I know that's not a gang sign. I know that that's a tagger.
Correct.
And then people in the community would get upset because we would actually distinguish between one and the other.
I would only, in the interest that you may have community members listening, a tagger, for instance, or graffiti vandal, person tagging a wall, may not meet the criteria to be what we're using a legal definition of a gang member. Nonetheless, the department is very concerned and is very aggressive. And in San Fernando Valley specifically, we assign dedicated investigators to graffiti vandals, recognizing not only the public blight, the concept of its intimidation in the community, much like a gang, but also the fact that it serves as a pathway to gangs. It is it's a gateway issue, and there are tagger groups today that constitute street gangs, that constitute the legal definition of a criminal street gang. And finally, we have we have acts of violence still occurring in our neighborhoods between gangs, but also between taggers and gangs, and between taggers themselves.
Well, in the Valley recently, wasn't it a tagger who got shot and killed? When all was said and done, it was one of the
this
in the last couple of weeks was.
Well, he's talking about the
Yeah, that one actually involved what they called themselves as a tagging crew, but it was
associating with Sanford.
And now this particular tagging crew wants to associate with a gang and wants protection, if you will, to be allowed to roam within the gang. And as a result of a dispute at a school, they ended up, being in
homicide. So it can be a real slippery slope for the at-risk youth, as I know you know, Council Member. And we do try and get the message out, and we want to work with. In fact, the biggest change for me coming over as a federal prosecutor to the city was, and we've embraced this change, is to work with the community to work and support the prevention and intervention, so that the youth know that what can start. For that 5% who want to join the gang, well, they're a difficult group, no question. But for that other 90 to 95%, it can be a slippery slope. It starts with tagging, and the leaders of the gang can be very good at recruiting and grooming, and in effect, I know you've often pointed out, hey, don't go to school. Well, you know what happens? The truancy rate does tend to create a pool of gangs. So it's
one of Councilmember Alarcon's number one constituents is getting impatient. So I want to let him go ahead and ask the question.
Be heard.
Absolutely.
She goes to all our gang meetings. I have a number of questions actually that have to do with timing process. First of all, who initiated the did the city of San Fernando officials request us to get involved? Were they initiating action, or did the city of Los Angeles go to the city of San Fernando?
I think we went to the city of San Fernando.
Okay. Could you explain that process? Because one of the uniquenesses of this injunction is that it involves two jurisdictions. I don't think the city of Los Angeles has ever been involved in an injunction that covered more than one jurisdiction.
Councilman,
is there one?
Yes. Well, I'm sorry, which question would you like? Would you like the
first, just the simple one, is there another gang injunction in the city of Los Angeles that is multi-jurisdictional?
There is not, however, with a couple of injunctions, for instance, with the 204th Street injunction and the East Side Payne down in the Harbor Gateway area, those gangs, East Side Torrance, I apologize. East Side Torrance, of course, by its very name, East Side Torrance, one would imagine was a Torrance gang. In fact, they largely occupy the Harbor Gateway area. However, in the process of seeking that injunction, and I know that was a matter of great importance to this council, in the process of seeking that injunction, we had lengthy discussions with the Torrance Police Department, as do I believe the LAPD did, in order to make sure that if Torrance wanted to participate, they could. However, they wanted to do it, because they had to be ready for the fact that when the injunction was in place, gang members may decide to move to Torrance, or to commit crimes in Torrance. And also, we've had Culver City gang injunctions that have involved these all predate my era, but it was my understanding that the Torrance part I was a part of.
Ask a simple question to a lawyer.
Well, that's true.
The simple answer is no. We don't have a multi-jurisdictional injunction in place, and that's the only question I want to.
This is the only injunction.
I'm not asking about coordination. I know we do a lot of coordination with many jurisdictions. I only want to know whether the injunction is if there's any other. I believe that's unique about this one, and that's why I'm asking. So the city of Los Angeles asked San Fernando. Could you explain how that process developed, particularly in light of our recent announcement that the GRZs, the gang reduction zones, are going into Pacoima and Panorama City North Hills, because those are driven by statistical analysis, and all the statistics said that those areas had the highest gang-related problems. So describe to me how we came about targeting Sylmar and the Sanford gang in particular versus going to where everybody else in the city thought we should be focusing. So I guess the roundabout question I'm trying to get to is, should we have done the GRZ in Sylmar instead of Pacoima, or in Sylmar instead of Panorama City, or I mean, how are we working at cross purposes here? Are we not consulting with each other on these issues? Because we seem to have different strategies employed in different ways. I'm not trying to jam you guys up,
Councilman,
here,
if I would like to respond, if you can.
Yeah, I'm trying to continue formulating my question as I go, but but the point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be a sort of disjunction between where the city attorneys and LAPD is going with the gang injunction in Sylmar versus the GRZs, and they're two different strategies, I recognize.
Correct.
In Pacoima and in North Hills, Panorama City, when those were designed around the statistics.
Okay. We actually had this question by the chair earlier and responded, and we'd be happy to, again, talk about it. The gang reduction zones, and that initiative is stemming from Mayor Villaraigosa's strategies of impacting gang violence, as you're well aware, and the identifying a territorial areas within the city of Los Angeles that a concentration of all resources, preventive intervention and suppression efforts, to not only interrupt and impact acts of gang violence, but the pathway to the gangs themselves, and perhaps even influence the ability of redirecting reentries, so that we can disable the impact that these gangs are having on identified communities. The mayor's office has identified a series of gang reduction zones, GRZs, of which in the San Fernando Valley, as I was asked where those zones might be, we identified a series of areas, of which Pacoima is one, and the Panorama City is another. They were not, however, in absence of any other competing areas that would also have benefited by identification of being a gang reduction zone. And yet there are a limit, as you know, with funding. I think before this council now, there is a limit as to 6 gang reduction zones which are presently funded at a level, one might argue sufficient or otherwise, but nonetheless 6 that are funded, and then 6 more that, and I'm not exactly here clearly on where that second stage funding is at, but the Panorama City is at second site. Now, having said that, the prioritization of the identification of those zones, LAPD did participate in. In concert with that initiative, or that major citywide strategy, is the existing practice strategy of using injunctions as one tool amongst a myriad of others on both the suppression side but also intervention prevention across neighborhoods throughout the city of Los Angeles, of which Sylmar, and in that neighborhood, has been in consideration for 4 or 5 years that I know of at a minimum. And as a department, we prioritize recognizing a limit of resources within the city attorney's office to actually craft and frame these injunctions. Sanford's has been listed in years past as a priority in concert with other injunctions in the San Fernando Valley that actually got on the ground and went forward. Canoga Park, Alabama, Langdon Street are 2 examples. As we sit here today, we have other areas that are impacted by gang violence in the San Fernando Valley that are in neither gang reduction zone nor in this injunction area itself that are deserving, as an application of a tool, a gang injunction. Are they also deserving of a gang reduction zone? Absolutely. However, as this city wrestles with the fiscal situation that I need not brief you two individuals on, you have a tremendous amount of weight on your shoulders to how do we determine where do we do versus what we don't.
Let me clarify, first of all, that I don't have a problem with utilizing the gang injunction tool. I've been a supporter of it. I requested it on Blythe Street and North Hills, and I think they've been very effective in those communities. They don't come without problems. The reality is that as much as we like to articulate our management positions, when implemented on the street, things can go awry and issues can arise. And they're not perfect tools. That's why they're scrutinized so carefully by the courts. I mean, that's the truth. The Sylmar community is unique in several ways. As I mentioned, it is has the highest rate of home ownership in my district, which runs counter to what is typically a gang area. In Blythe Street, we knew that Blythe had control because they'd be on top of the apartment buildings as lookouts, even soliciting the council member to see what he wanted to purchase when he would drive by. I don't get that same experience when I drive through the neighborhoods of Sylmar, I also don't have a problem with targeting the Sanford gang because I am well aware of their institutional relationship, I should say, with Emmett, and interestingly, that is not necessarily a visible relationship to the general community. Only law enforcement officials and people who've been informed by law enforcement officials know about that. The point I'm trying to make in that regard is the community of Sylmar. Some of the language in the injunction paints Sylmar as a community that is terrorized, for example, and it is not. It does not have that same sense. In Blythe Street, the residents were terrorized. They couldn't associate anywhere. I go to Sylmar and I go to an opening day of baseball, and there's 5,000 people out there. They're not terrorized by the gangs. They control the park. The park director is doing an amazing job, and while they may be there on occasion, that park is being utilized by the community. On Blythe Street, they had no baseball field, and they didn't have a park until we created one as part of the strategies that included the injunction. So there's a completely different dynamic, and I have no problem with surgically going after, to use the chairman's term, going after the Sanford gang, but the language of the injunction I believe, if the community of Sylmar had the time to read the language of the injunction, I think they would be offended, and I do think it does have an impact on the property values, on the attitudes, on their I do believe that their emotional state is upset. And I would have liked to have seen, and I've mentioned this to the city attorney directly, I would have liked to have seen, and I don't know to what extent you can incorporate these into the language of the injunction, but there should be some of the positive elements of Sylmar that are made much more clear. I get complaints from that community as we get from all communities. The complaints I get in Sylmar have more to do with taggers than they do with gangbangers. Again, because the drug trade, which is their primary reason for being in a community, is sort of a silent problem, and the community members are engaged in it as well. Quite frankly, they have to have somebody to sell to, but the tagging that comes closer to terrorizing the community, and in fact, they are crews that are going out. And I've had meetings with the Sylmar graffiti busters to discuss this problem. So I would have actually, and I've had some tentative conversations about looking at doing injunctions on the taggers. I think we need, in Sylmar, I'll tell you, the community would have no hesitation in supporting going after some of the tagging groups. And as we all know, 2 taggers were recently shot in that area, and it seemed to be a crew against a crew kind of shooting. And there's a fine line between a crew and a gang. I think they walk like a duck, talk like a duck, and the rest. But so I, as the council member, I wanted to make it clear that I don't have a problem with a surgical injunction against the Sanford gang. I've dealt with them in my own personal life, and I know what it's like to walk into local AM/PM and see a couple of guys with Sanford tattoos on their forehead, walk in, it can be upsetting. And if the local council member, can be concerned, I assure you the grandmothers are out there scared to death. So, but this one, it paints a broad negative picture of Sylmar, a community that I think is a very nice community. And while there is criminal activity that needs to be targeted, I felt some innocent victims of that painting were created, and I would like to work with the LAPD and the city attorney to refine the injunction so that it more specifically targets and identifies the Sanford gang-related activities, but at the same time paints the picture of Sylmar that I know, a good community, an organizing community that's active in their community. They're more terrorized by the foreclosure activity, quite frankly. They've lost more homes than probably anywhere in the region, and that is having just as much an upsetting effect on Sylmar. So if there's a way to tighten the injunction, there's a way to, as the chairman expressed, more surgically describe the activities and target those activities. You would have my complete support for that kind of direction. And in the meantime, we do have. I'm not here to say that there is no Sanford gang problem. There is a Sanford gang problem in Sylmar. Most of them have moved from San Fernando. I think there's more members in Sylmar than there are in San Fernando, and it is something that we have to contend with.
Thank you, sir.
Councilman, one of our challenges with trying to refine it and make it even smaller is that I had a meeting yesterday with several community members. I met with some members of the Sylmar Chamber of Commerce as well, and some people are actually calling for us to expand it, to make it larger, to incorporate the north side of the freeway.
But I'm the councilman. I'm not some people. I'm much more aware of the process of injunctions, having supported them and worked with them closely. I'm not talking an average citizen making this request. This is the councilman making this request based on my experience in working with law enforcement and the city attorney, and knowing this community, living in this community, and working actually, if anybody in the community was terrorized by a gang, it was me at one point in one experience when 200 gang members were partying 2 doors down and were urinating on my front lawn, and we had to take action. So I mean, I know what can happen. I'm just saying that it's not as broad as what seemed to be painted in the injunction that I read.
And perhaps Mr. Reardon can discuss the mechanics of what the complaint, how the complaint articulates this, and what it's meant to describe versus what it's meant to describe versus what it's perceived as describing.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Council Member, for your articulate statement. There were so many points of agreement, as I know you know we have. There are a few points I'd respectfully disagree, for lack of a better word. Respectful of your great knowledge of your district, as well as of the gang problem that goes back many, many years. And you've frequently stated in public very accurate portrayals of gang activity, drugs, violence, that you're doing everything you can to prevent and stop. But 5 points I just wanted to respond to, and I guess lawyers do like to number things as well, so I apologize in advance. The first part, I think maybe the most important one, but that's why I put it first, is the GRZs, the clear sites, and the gang injunctions. There are a lot of layers going on in the city now because we have such a big gang problem, and it is so multidimensional, and it's very different in the south from the east, in the valley from Venice. I've learned more about that in the last 16 or 18 months than I ever knew I would learn. In the Valley, the problem is different, very different from south of the so-called Watts area of the city. However, there's an important distinction with the GRZs and gang injunctions and suppression efforts. As I know the council member is aware, but I want to make sure the public record reflects that even within the mayor's office, there are two deputy mayors. There's Deputy Mayor Carr and Deputy Mayor Alican. They have split the suppression efforts, which Deputy Mayor Alican and Deputy Mayor Carr. As you know, my accent from Boston just kills me when it comes to these A's, and I apologize. Deputy Mayor Alican has responsibility for public safety. We consult with him. I consult with him sometime on a daily basis, but absolutely on a weekly basis onto general goals and projects with regard to clear sites as well as gang injunctions. Deputy Mayor Carr has the intervention prevention side of the House that now has been transferred entirely to the mayor's jurisdiction. Those are the GRZs. The GRZs are something new, something entirely new, at least in my experience, that is going to focus targeted resources for prevention and intervention into hotspots. We were not consulted as the city attorney's office on that, nor perhaps should we have been. The LAPD was, and yeah, I've heard Chief Moore's input on that as well as others. That was, is my understanding, very statistically based, as it probably should have been, but that's not for me to comment. The point is, that's going to be, those are the places where the prevention and intervention side of the House, or Reverend Carr's side, and the mayor are going to make their stand. That's my understanding. They're going to make their stand in those relatively small hotspots, tailored surgical hotspots, and try and make a significant reduction on the prevention and intervention side, and one that's accountable and reliable, so that we don't have a situation where 10 years go by and no one can point to maybe any more than 2 people who have actually been prevented or intervened from joining a gang or leaving a gang. And that's an important project, and we support that any way we can. We have some prevention role. We believe that that the existence of the gang injunction is one method for particularly for hangers-on to gangs to say, I don't want this trouble. This is a good reason for me to get out of here and vote with my feet and just move as far away from this bad influence as I can. But the so there really is no inconsistency. We have clear sites where there's focus.
Let me be clear. I said that the perception might be, and I'm not saying that's my opinion, but you know, recognizing that the public is seeing all the city doing this. Some of the questions that have come to me is, why did they do it in Sylmar versus Pacoima? We just had 2 or 3 gang-related killings in Pacoima. Why wasn't it there? Why are we? You know, we had taggers.
I'm sorry, it is there. Just for the point of clarification, the gang reduction zone is there.
No, I'm talking about. They're talking about the injunction.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, these are the questions that.
And there is a gang injunction there as well.
Oh, okay.
The Project Boys.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm sorry.
There's not a perfect overlap of the gang reduction zones.
But they were not. Let me make it clear. The Project Boys were not involved in the shootings.
No, I'm sorry, sir.
We're not.
What we probably, again, of the 3 gang shootings that have happened in Foothill, one of them, the information we have is that it does involve, to some degree, Project Boys. I'm not at liberty to discuss the degree of it, but again, your point's taken, which is the complexities of the strategies of this city are oftentimes misconstrued or not understood.
Yes.
Our obligation, as all of us, is to provide clarity.
That's why the chairman and I had a conversation about a need to have this
perception versus reality. I could not agree with you more, Council Member, as I believe I said last week, but as I say frequently, and maybe as the newcomer, it's easier for me to say. There are more misunderstandings and misconceptions about what's going on with gang efforts in the city of LA on the prevention, intervention, and suppression side than there are understandings. In government, I believe, whether it's the city council, the council members here, this committee, which has contributed mightily to the situation, day in, day out, LAPD, and I hope the same is true for the city attorney's office, we have a pretty good understanding of what we're doing, and we communicate with each other. But we need to get the message out as a group to the community. This is what a GRZ is. This is what a gang injunction is. This is what a clear site is. On the gang injunction side, I hope in every way, even if we do respectfully disagree on certain points, sir, I hope in every way we've demonstrated to you that we embrace that goal of getting the message out, and we will, we don't come to this appearance today or last week with any with any involuntariness. We're voluntarily here to answer those questions and get that information out.
The one thing that I was hoping you would cover was the issue of how a community is painted in a motion before the court.
That's my second point, Your Honor. Sir, I apologize that Your Honor comes so naturally after 20 years in court. Sir, the second point is the papers. We'd invite the community. In fact, we're meeting with block captains. Your block captains, block captains in your district have asked us to come in and give them copies of the injunction, which we're doing this later this evening. I'm going to be part of that, as is our neighborhood gang prosecutor who's here today, our deputy in charge of gang prosecutions in the Valley who's here today, our supervisor who supervises Valley and Central, Valley and South efforts. We have, I think, and it's been a positive over the last 16 to 18 months, really tried to be as Valley-centric as possible with our decisions to allocate our resources to prosecutors who know the Valley, who are not outsiders to the Valley, who either live there or work there or have done so for a long time. And we think they're in the best position to make those tough decisions that Councilmember, the chairman was talking about, those tough decisions such as turning a case down. And just as you've heard from your community, sometimes anger when you say, look, that's not a gang-related crime. I can assure you that those rolling 60s cases that I was talking about often led to very unpleasant discussions, and sometimes even members of those task forces would quit and say, look, I'm going to leave. I'm not going to prosecute gangs. I'm not going to investigate them if you're not going to charge all my cases. But you have to hold the line on that. That's our job. That said, our papers actually, the order, for example, the ultimate order, the preliminary injunction order, is devoid of really much characterization. It's very legalistic. And we're going to have copies of that. We'll hand it out. Our evidence, which includes we don't make any attempt, and by the way, to answer your question from earlier, ultimately the signing authority here is Mr. Cooley, Mr. Delgadillo, Mr. Isaacs, I believe you're familiar with, my boss, and myself, and we do that in consultation all the way up to the top with Chiefs Paysinger, Bratton, as well as the chief of the San Fernando Police Department. We don't take this action lightly. That said, for the record, and I think it's important to note that our papers do describe the 130 incidents of acts of terror. The community may not be terrorized across the board, but these are pretty terrible acts that are described in our papers. And we, as a prosecutor, all I can say is that now 20 years in, we have to describe our evidence, and sometimes it is brutal in its description. Sometimes the crimes, what's said during the crimes, some of the things in our papers that are alleged to have been said and occurred are ugly and terrible acts. But we have a responsibility within the rules and fairness and equities of due process to put our best case on. And whether that's a civil injunction or whether it's a criminal case, we do have that responsibility. I believe, having signed off on these papers and reviewed them both before signing off and now again subsequently several times, I believe we've fulfilled that responsibility to the community. I strongly believe that. And that's the one area, perhaps the only area today, that I respectfully disagree with Council Member from CD7, because I do believe our papers, when read as a whole, are respectful, are professional, are extremely well done and tailored to focus on the incidents of terror that have occurred. In no way are they, or to put it another way, I don't think anyone besides persons like yourself, sir, and us who've spent so long working with gangs, I think we know best that gangs are a subset, a small subset of any community, but they are a terrible subset in many ways. They're terrible because they commit crimes, and they intimidate people, but maybe what I've come to realize, and I think part of that is through your urging, they're terrible because of the risk they represent to the youth who will join them. And that's a real tragedy, because that can be prevented, and we're doing everything we can to support those GRZs, but they are not suppression efforts. I hope that was helpful in that.
Thank you. I'm going to do my best to go through the latter part of my questions to get them on the record. As was mentioned by, I guess, all of us speaking for the last hour and a half, a lot of what we're doing right here is informing the public of some facts and some nuances that perhaps they either misunderstand or they have yet to even hear about. So when it comes to the gang injunctions, inevitably in the long run, do they end up having juveniles and adults on the list?
Well,
I mean, we don't exclude one or the other. If they qualify to be on that list, whether they're juveniles or adults, then they are on the list.
Yes, and you know, so that Councilman Alarcon's earlier question about San Fernando, I personally spoke with and worked with then Chief Tony Alba, the City of San Fernando PD, and then his predecessor, now Chief Robert Aldehyde. The City of San Fernando, their police department, and LAPD work very closely on the gang problem in the northern San Fernando Valley. So this is an injunction that is unique in the sense that, at least in the San Fernando Valley, that it involves multiple city jurisdictions. We've worked closely with the police department there historically, and we've amplified that recently where we actually have their officers working with some of our gang officers to exchange information and intelligence, because this gang does move through that neighborhood. To the point of the juvenile and adults, the department recognizes that the gang membership is both at the juvenile as well as adult level. This injunction will apply to both. The prosecution against the juvenile will be at the through the juvenile court, which is the district attorney's office. The prosecution of an adult will be through the city attorney's office if the matter stays as a misdemeanor.
Okay. Or if it's a
unless it occurs
case,
in the
then
city.
it's the DA.
Yes, and then also the only other exception.
And it could also have a federal case which be prosecuted at the federal level. Okay.
And then one last exception, and I apologize for but for the record, City of San Fernando, the enforcement there in that city of an injunction will be via the district attorney's office.
Okay.
Because they are
have a city attorney's office like we do.
They
have
don't.
a city attorney hired, just don't want to go into details, but
Yes.
we happen to be a city that's fortified with its own elected city attorney and department.
Yes.
Yes.
Correct. Okay. Now, in order for somebody to go from being a candidate to be added to the list to going through the process and determining whether or not a name is going to be added to a gang injunction list, if it commences with a police officer, is it only exclusively gang officers or an officer working, for example, who makes that recommendation based on their findings out in the field of that individual?
Yes, the identification of new individuals that would be subject, that we would make an application to apply their admittance into the gang injunction will be via the gang enforcement detail, uniformed gang officers. Those are subject matter experts. The enforcement, once an individual has been named and serviced and included now and subject to the conditions of the gang injunction, the enforcement of that provision will be allowed, uniformed, or any previously trained and qualified officer of the department will be able to take enforcement action to a person in apparent violation of that injunction. So it's the addition of new people will just be via the gang detail. That's the primary vehicle. The enforcement of once you're in that, you're subject to that injunction, whether it be 5 or 100 people, could be at a mission officer, uniform officers on patrol in that neighborhood witnessing a violation. The city attorney's office is providing detailed training to all of the personnel as to the limitations and powers of that injunction.
Okay, so an officer who is not a gang officer would not if they felt need to commence that process of saying, you know, I think this person is a Sanfed gang member and he's not on the list, or she's not on the list, could be a woman.
That's right.
Then that officer would forward that to a gang officer, and then the gang officer would do the more details, et cetera, before it would forward beyond that?
Correct. And quite often, that's one of the processes that occurs, that our patrol officers come in contact with Sanford gang members or suspected gang members. They take down the information, the fact pattern that they have on hand, and they provide that information to our detectives, our gang detectives and our gang enforcement detail, who then due diligence in terms of follow-up for that information.
Now, is that a custom and practice, or is that a procedure that has to be adhered to? You understand the difference,
Yes.
right, Chief?
There's two aspects of this going on. One, to answer your question immediately, it's a custom and practice. Many times, the other vehicle that Captain Villegas did not identify is that we'll arrest an individual in that area that we believe to be a Sanford gang member. We believe it because we asked the person, and he has Sanford maybe tattooed on his forehead, and he says,
And obviously, if somebody on their own volition says, I am a Sanford gang member, then who are you to question whether or not they're...
In fairness, however, that still would not, in and of itself, even though committed right before a uniformed police officer and had the person here, that would not cause that person for an application immediately that would go through a gang officer, go through the gang enforcement detail at Mission, that would then do the due diligence of research, that would then apply with the city attorney to review this fact pattern to whether or not this person should be added to that injunction. That is the custom right now in practice. There is presently a draft order that formalizes these best practices, what we've learned over the last 5 or 10 years about the use of injunctions.
Okay.
And we are working on that together.
I like that. I like the fact that you're working on it. But how long has that draft order been in its process?
I have seen it. It's on my desk. I commented on it just last week. It is, I believe, it is an office of operations order, which effectively identifies the protocols and guidelines of the application or the use of gang injunctions. I believe it's in its final draft form and should be published, I would think, within the next few months.
Now, when you say published, it gets the proper scrutiny and or signature of particular brass within the department, or is that the kind of thing that goes to the police commission before it becomes an order?
This will be an office of operations, which means all basically the enforcement efforts of uniformed and detective personnel in the city of Los Angeles will be subject to it. It'll be signed by Assistant Chief Earl Pasinger. It will not be something that certainly the police commission could exercise its authority and choose to take.
But it's not required for them to exercise their authority before it becomes a document that is utilized by the department as an order.
No.
Not at this point, no.
We have good reason to believe that the police commission, like you, supports this in every way.
Okay. Now, when it comes to gang injunctions, are there automatically resources that the department brings to bear on that area, or it's subject to what's available to the department and what resources they can bring to bear? You follow what I'm saying?
Yes, sir. This is another way of phrasing it's an unfunded mandate. This is an added tool. The existing resources, it adds a tool to those existing resources. It gives us another tool for the problem.
So adding a gang injunction to the responsibility within the city in the process we've just described does not automatically create a trigger of additional budgets moving toward the city attorney's office or the police department in order for them to do their job. It's something internal that both of your respective departments need to figure out how you're going to enhance and hopefully do the best job you can to enforce it, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not a triggering mechanism. It's not like with each order comes $5 million from the general fund to the, and then to be divvied up between the city attorney.
It's purely resource allocation within the city attorney's office.
If we had that in the city, if we had such a mechanism, the policymakers who handle the budget for the city of Los Angeles, if we actually did such a thing, would that be something that would help the enforcement of a gang injunction once it happens? Because ideally, when you have a gang injunction, you would like to do certain activities, and you would like to enforce it in certain ways, because you actually are now treating that area and that gang differently than you would without an injunction. So ideally, you have internal self-expectations and things that you'd like to do that inevitably require resources, correct?
Yes, inevitably, everything requires resources, and it's a constant balancing act, as you know.
Chief Moore, I know you understand. This sounds kind of mundane. That question I asked you,
No.
you know the answer is obvious.
No.
Yes, it requires more resources. But the thing that I need to remind the people of Los Angeles is, every time they expect us as a city to do something, every time they want more police officers or they want this or that to commence and fortify their community, in this case for better public safety, inevitably there's resources that should come to bear in order for us to step that up or enhance or implement, correct?
Yes, and when we talked about earlier the prioritization of gang injunctions, one of the influencers is, do we have the resources to enforce the injunctions? And in this instance, we have police patrols. We have existing police patrols that we believe this will add a tool to their arsenal to go out and influence conduct that presently they can't influence other than by staring or a consensual encounter. This will allow them to instead initiate police action. So that it's an existing resource. If we were to have added resources, it's like the CLEAR details that exist. CLEAR details, which is the Community Law Enforcement and Recovery Act, which, Councilman, certainly you're aware of in Foothill area. We, as a department, have grant monies, and the city has found funding to establish as a priority added uniformed resources as well as overtime resources, because the even heightened or greater intensity of that initiative absolutely requires the existing Captain Carreri and Foothill would not be able to accomplish the goals of that level of great intensity without added resources. An injunction, we believe, can be used and invoked and used effectively at a lower intensity, if you will, with existing resources and not require the added overtime or the added personnel. Not to say that if we didn't have it, we couldn't use it, but as we look at the city budget with great affection for what the city has been able to support this department with in very tough times, we are not looking for more.
Correct.
No, but the thing is, what you just described over the last couple of minutes of resources and some examples, broad examples, that's by and large suppression-oriented resources. Would it be appropriate or help the effectiveness of reducing crime in that area if the city were to enhance these gang injunctions with resources for intervention, prevention to complement the suppression efforts that will be stepped up in that area?
Go ahead. If I may, sir, yes, and okay. That's a work in progress too. I think three things for us, for the city attorney's office. I know because I participated in these evaluations. We've decided, the city attorney Delgadillo has decided that if you have 100 priorities, you've got none. And our priorities on the criminal side, we have prioritized gang violence and membership, number 1, school safety, number 2, health care advocacy, consumer advocacy, number 3. I know the council is well aware of that. Just yesterday's ordinance relates to that. And by making those priorities, we've then allocated resources within existing resource allocation is what we've done. Of course, there's always an issue of more resources, but it may be a better idea. What you've just said is the ultimate goal, is to have these, is by working with Deputy Mayor Carr, by working with Deputy Mayor Alicant, by working with this ad hoc committee and the LAPD, and at times the district attorneys and the U.S. attorneys, and on, if we can allocate our resources so that it would work as the carrot and the stick. That's the new goal, and that maybe that should have been the goal 20 years ago. But who can go back in time? In a time machine, none of us can. But the goal now is the carrot and stick
and move forward.
Correct.
And if I could, this is the question for the San Fernando Valley. As people ask me, and they ask our city elected officials such as yourself, with gang reduction zones, there's a in the focused intensity on prevention, intervention, suppression, there's a suggestion that we're drawing resources, or there's a void of resources in other parts of the valley. With some 1,400 gang crimes last year, they were not entirely in the number 1 and number 2 gang reduction zones.
Correct.
A significant portion were. However, the essence of the San Fernando Valley Coalition on Gangs the partnerships, the coalition of elected officials with public and private entities, including the school district, Rexon Park, the faith-based communities, organizations such as New Directions for Youth, community schools, Boys and Girls Clubs. They have a blanket. They make a network, a fabric across the entire San Fernando Valley. And as we focus with this gang reduction zone initiative in these two major areas, we cannot ignore, and this initiative is evidence, this injunction is evidence that nor will we ignore, that we have other tools and we have other resources and we have other obligations to these other communities. We are pursuing that with this injunction. In concert, Captain Villegas, his leadership with the Silmar community, the Silmar Youth Task Force, the communities that are the neighborhood councils and those community-based organizations and the schools that exist in the Silmar community, they have an opportunity with this added tool to enrich their efforts even more. New resources? No. Existing resources, yes, but this is an initiative that's going to, in my mind, give them an opportunity to amplify their impact. We're having, in this community, beginning in June, we're taking the Teen Extreme experience that began at Canoga Park, that spread to Van Nuys. We're bringing it to the Silmar community, to a park that will begin on every Friday night. There are no resources for that. There is nothing new, but this is an effort that we believe that this injunction, frankly, is going to help us support the safety of those parks during those hours. And yet, and so there's a linkage here, if you will,
right,
that these intervention prevention services have an opportunity. They should view this as an opportunity. If they view it as where's our added resources so that we can amplify our resources, unfortunately, I think that in these budgetary times, it's going to be tough.
And if I may,
but budgetary times being tough or not, ideally, to fortify an area like this that would have a gang injunction, to fortify it with more resources of suppression, intervention, and prevention, and might as well throw reentry in there as well,
yes,
which is an old concept but never funded until recently by the state of California, at least a little bit. When you look at all those tools and to enhance and fortify resources for all of those prongs of those tools, that would, in fact, be an improvement for that community.
LAPD welcomes that. The reality of this is, and this mayor certainly has, with Reverend Carr's appointment and Arif Alicon's leadership as the deputy mayor in public safety and homeland security, this is not a sole suppression effort. We welcome every opportunity for added prevention and intervention services, whether it be reentry or stopping the child from getting to the gang lifestyle to begin with. We welcome all those initiatives, and added funding opportunities exist, and we stand as a partner in any strategic effort to impact gang violence.
Now, I have some questions to the city attorney's office. Another aspect we've only touched on very lightly in this particular motion that we're discussing on item number 1 is the process and or removal of someone's name on the gang injunction list. Let me bring the people listening up to speed. We brought this to the attention of the city attorney's office with a question. The city attorney met with me, the chairman of the committee, and you, Bruce, led with your team in the city attorney's office to actually put together a formal process by which people can petition to have themselves removed from a gang injunction list. At that time, one of the examples that my colleague Janice Hahn brought up is a person who is on a gang injunction list in her district, who is now like at Michigan State playing on the football team or what have you.
Nebraska, I think.
Completely disengaged from his community, focused on being a student and an athlete, and has changed his life. She used that as an example that he should have an opportunity to get off of that list. Not that he should automatically be removed. Nobody has ever asked the city attorney's office to do that, at least in this committee in those examples. But she used that as an example of how, let's call him one of my favorite football player, just anonymous, Joe Green. What if this guy's name is Joe Green and he's on a list? Joe Green should have the opportunity to be removed from the list. How does he or his mother or somebody say, fill out this application? There is now an application process?
Yes.
What's the status of that process? Is it available to the public now, or is it not available yet?
Thank you, sir. I also share your devotion to the Steel Curtain and Joe Green, but to get to the point, we're in process, just as you described the process. That was a 100% accurate. We now have taken it a couple of steps further, and let me describe those as briefly as I can, although the brevity does not, and I know that's exactly what the council member is saying, the fact this is coming up at the tail end and that it's brief does not in any way underline or change its significance. It's very significant, actually.
Well, it just took 2 minutes to bring us up to speed over the last 18 months, so go ahead.
Last 18 months, particularly over the last 6 months since we appeared in front of council last October, I believe it was, we now have online this English version of the petition as well as a Spanish version of the petition. The Spanish version of the petition I'd like to submit to this committee formally so that it's part of the record. That also is online, and I'll do that at the end.
Thank you.
And I'll also ask anyone that the council member wants to please review that as you have in the past. And if there's, it's our best effort to create a Spanish version. We think we have an excellent Spanish-speaking staff at the city attorney's office, but it goes back to no one's perfect. And we are still evolving that process. Here's some more evolution in the last several months. We have now located, targeted, and had a happy acceptance by a group in our office known as the Crime Prevention and Youth Protection Group. It's a small group of lawyers and staff who focus on crime prevention and youth protection. For instance, they oversee Operation Bright Future, our anti-truancy program that I know is highly regarded by many members of the council, and I believe yourself, sir. They used to oversee Kid Watch that was then moved into the mayor's office, a very successful program. They have, in a process of consultation over the last several months, really stepped up, and they want to help us implement this petition, and that's so important for a variety of reasons that I know you know.
So they're going to help with outreach and awareness about the process?
Both. The outreach and awareness about the process, which is a work in progress, but also the review. And the key there is to get the review. Prosecutors like myself, for better or worse, have a certain mindset that you've seen reflected even today. We want our gang prosecutors to have input in the process if someone fills out a petition. But we don't want our gang prosecutors, myself included, to be the final arbiter, because we do have a mindset. I think the mindset's appropriate, but it is a mindset. At the same time, we want LAPD input from their gang experts, but they're not going to be the last word either, nor do I think they want to be. They want to have input. We will have a group in our office who are not gang prosecutors, whose mission have never been gang prosecutors, although they're familiar with the problem and they're educating themselves as fast as possible. But what they are is their expertise is with just crime prevention for youth and youth protection. Seems like the right group, and they've risen to the task. They will be the place where the review sits. They will also help with the outreach and the output. And the last part on that, if I may, is we have also spent some significant time in the last several months meeting with Reverend Carr and his staff, supplying Reverend Carr and his staff of outstanding project managers with information about the process, with information about injunctions, so that we can seek their input, because we saw over the last month. Now with the plan actually has evolved because we had also reached out to, for instance, Bridges 1, Bridges 2, because we needed their input. Now, where we are the fortunate recipients, or maybe this process is, of having everything housed under Reverend Carr's group. We will seek their input on any petition within the city as well, to see what they know and what they can offer with regard to the ultimate decision.
So the process to prepare for implementation is now complete?
Basically, it is complete, yes.
So that means you now have it online?
Yes,
so where people can actually start filling it out?
Yes.
Now, that means that if somebody went online last night and they filled it out and double-checked it and made sure everything was complete, they can now turn it into the city attorney's office, and the city attorney's office will receive it and now start to process that?
Correct. That is, and in fact, the new petition even has the new address of crime prevention and youth protection. That change was just made in the last couple of weeks. And in anticipation of this meeting, your meetings spur us along. Don't let us, if I'm not clear on that, they're helpful. In anticipation of this meeting, it gives us important deadlines to meet, and we appreciate that as lawyers.
So that being the case, and I know this is a process that will hopefully now commence, and we will see petitions, and we will see that fairness played out, because the application, I think, is written very fair, and I think the application is done in a very sensitive manner, so as not to require somebody to hire a lawyer to be able to fill it out. And that was something that I want to compliment the city attorney's office, even though probably drafted by almost exclusively by lawyers, but it wasn't drafted so that only lawyers could understand it or only a lawyer could actually complete it appropriately. Now,
Exactly.
I appreciate the fact that that's the case, that it has been done in a user-friendly manner for the end user, which is somebody who'd like to get off the list or at least petition for it. How long do you anticipate? Again, I'm not going to hold you to an exact time because this is a work in progress.
Yes.
But is this the kind of process that hopefully somebody can commence a petition, and if they complete their end of the process of providing all the information necessary for a proper evaluation and determination, is that something that would take several weeks or perhaps closer to several months?
There are two answers to that. One, and oddly enough, but perhaps it's just it's a nature of the process, as you said, an evolving process. So far, the only trickle of applications have been from people with pending criminal cases, which have to be resolved first. And that was not, that's not the ideal group.
That's a particular category.
It's a category.
Petition.
But
yeah.
the better category, of course, is the people you and I have talked about.
Like the Joe Green example.
Joe Green,
that would be another extreme category.
Person whose
person
family
no longer residing in the area, a person who's actually as verification that they're physically and somewhere else, and their activities, by and large, certainly don't resemble that of being involved in a gang in their old neighborhood.
They want to be able to go home, and they want to have their name removed from any sort of a stigma, is a word that's often used with.
So that example, hopefully, would be considered an example that would seem to have a decent amount of expediency through this new process. Again,
the goal,
providing that the person actually fills out the thing and provides all the information necessary for proper evaluation.
We are
correct?
Correct. We're preparing a series.
About how long you figure?
Well, we're preparing a series of cover letters that answer your very question. We anticipate some of these forms will be filled out, half filled out, or perhaps incorrectly filled out. That's not an insult to anyone. That's the nature of form filling. I fill out forms incorrectly sometimes, and people have to correct me. That's the nature of filling out forms. That said, if a form is filled out incorrectly, it's going to take longer. But if Mr. Joe Green does want to return home to visit his family, and wants to do so free of any stigma and believes he's got the bona fides to show it, we anticipate about a 90-day process that will include the input from all the relevant parties.
Okay, fair enough. And again, this committee is not going to hold you to that 90 days because I hope and expect that each individual application will be respected as an individual application, not as some boilerplate. Oh, I've seen this kind before, rejected. Or I've seen this kind before. Great. He's a football player. The last guy was at Michigan. This guy's a football player over at Ohio State, so therefore he's off the list. I think that any kind of if it were done in that fashion without the proper vetting of that particular individual application, even though some people might think, well, that's a victory, somebody got off the list. I think it's not a victory because the process should be respected on both sides. The person applying to the process and the person's applying the process in order to have a process of integrity.
It has to be, sir. You're absolutely right. If it's not case by case, it won't have integrity, and there'll be accusations on both sides. From one side, people will try and game the system. If I say 5 things, I know that I'll get off. Again, I'm not insulting people. That just happens. That's part of being in law enforcement. You know you have to be wary of that. On the flip side, if we're not doing it case by case, we as a city will open ourselves up to criticism, exposure, liability that we can't have, and that every exercise of our discretion, I know you exercise, as the council member reminded us, as a council member, your exercise of discretion is very significant, and in every decision you make, consequences attach, and that's why you approach it carefully.
Now, getting back to the gang injunction, can you describe to me, are the curfews, et cetera, those kinds of elements, are they particular from one injunction to another, such as, for example, curfews, or is that a standard in gang injunctions?
In some jurisdictions, there appears to be a standard approach. Our jurisdiction doesn't follow that approach. Probably not surprised to hear that. We, in some injunctions, ask for curfews, and others we don't, depending on the facts, depending on what LAPD's facts to us indicate. The curfews that we do ask for, we think are very much in keeping with the relevant case law, which insists that they be very highly tailored, have numerous exceptions. I mean, it has often been said about, sometimes by law enforcement, and rightfully so, that the curfews that we that we ask to have imposed by the court have so many exceptions that the exception swallows the rule. But we do that because curfew is an area, historically, by the courts and by the leaders of our communities, like yourself, that has been careful, and like Mr. Delgadillo and Mr. Bratton, has to be carefully tailored. It cannot be, it can be misused and abused, therefore it has to be policed.
Okay. Congratulations. Anybody who testifies before this committee for at least 2 hours gets a free bottle of water. So not an hour and a half, not an hour and 45 minutes, but at least 2 hours. So we've crossed that threshold. So please. Now, so the thing is, the courts are the ones that have the final outcome determination of what the curfew should be, and then the tailored issues like you just described as to how and what times the curfews can be utilized.
Correct. The court, the two of the areas that I have seen the most activity from the judges, as you can well imagine, is they carefully scrutinize every part of the order because they realize this is a significant imposition on a community. That's my impression. The areas they really scrutinize the curfew details. They really scrutinize the provision we've talked about many times, sir, and it has never been utilized, but it still exists, the opt-out provision. We've changed now our language because it's, as you pointed out to me in January when I first came on, your people use this word renounce. It's a loaded word. We don't use that word anymore because it is a loaded word. We now call it opt-out. And that's not just semantics. That was your and many people's impression bubbling up to us that a gang member can't use that word, renounce, without potentially creating
other repercussions. Now, I don't know the answer to this question. I hope you do. Of the gang injunction, I keep wanting to call them petitions, is not to confuse the public, but you know the legal term. But of the city of Los Angeles, how many of those have been denied?
We have had none denied. None, as I understand it, and this is a little bit of a history lesson for me, but I have tried as much as possible to learn the history of this and study it over the last 15 to 16 months. We do have 36 injunctions in place. 3 of those are preliminary. 33 are permanent.
And the Sanfed one is a preliminary category?
That would be
right
the 37th because it is
okay.
not yet in place. It is not yet a preliminary injunction. It's only pending. We have those 36 cover 56 identified criminal street gangs. And we use, by the way, and this is maybe something that's of great relevance to those who practice in the area, we do use the STEP Act definitions of criminal street gangs. Again, we try and insist on the letter of the law at every turn. That said, with our gang injunctions, in the early years, Blythe Street, for example.
Blythe was the first.
Blythe was the first.
1993, I think it was.
It went through a lengthy, as you well know, a lengthy process in the court system and there were a lot of revisions and evolutions. And we believe we've adapted our gang injunctions now to be, we certainly hold ourselves out and believe we can say proudly that we are the model of how to do gang injunctions in the city. And that's a team effort. That's working as a city, not just as a city attorney's office. That said, I don't know that any of our gang injunctions have been denied. I think that the reason for that is that we produce overwhelming evidence. That's certainly what we aim to do, and that has the amount of time. There are gang injunction jurisdictions that say we can do one in 6 months. We can put one together in 6 months. We take 9 months. This was over 12 months, even going back as long as 18 months to 2 years of developing evidence, because we want it to be right, we want it to be fair, and we want it to be an overwhelming presentation of evidence, because if we can't make that presentation, then maybe we should be using some other tool.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because one of the things that I've noticed in my thinking about gang injunctions and realizing that the first one in the city of Los Angeles was in 1993, and we brought up the Avenues injunction, which was commenced in 2003, and I mentioned that with all due respect, there is no, and we pass ordinances all the time, separate and apart from injunctions on the city council level. The vast majority of what we do don't have sunsets, and gang injunctions don't have sunsets. So what is the measure of success of a gang injunction, or is that in and of itself a point in time where the city of Los Angeles looks at a particular crime statistics and it's not a wave after all, it's a constant, and then we realize, you know what, this community is just going to have a gang injunction until perpetuity?
Well,
how do we measure our success? When do we know when that tool has, hopefully along with other tools, has been so effective that community can now be lifted? And again, I'm not being specific about a particular gang injunction, okay? I want to make that very clear. I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the police chief, and I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of Rocky Dalgadillo, our city attorney, et cetera. I'm just saying, just generically, how do we measure success with our gang injunctions?
And I'll limit my comments to just the deputy chief of the San Fernando Valley.
There you go. I respect that, and that's all I can ask.
How because we have Canoga Park and Blythe as one of the original ones, as well as Langdon Street and Project Boys, and we're hopeful that the Sanford gang injunction will find traction and implementation. I look at it as a tool in enforcing in our suppression efforts for gang violence. How I measure whether or not it's still relevant, which I think is your question, is that gang still relevant in that community? Does that gang still perpetuate violence? Does it still perpetuate and act out in its narcotic sales or intimidation of that neighborhood? And I asked that of my area captains and of our GIT lieutenants and the people who run the gang detail. And as we look at gang crime, one of the tools, and as we talk or complain about it, or whether it be Canoga Park, Alabama, for instance, and they'll have acts of gang violence. Well, what are we doing with the injunction? Because the injunction should be a tool to assist us in reducing gang crime.
Reducing gang crime,
yes.
Focusing on a particular element,
right,
causing those crimes.
So it's a gang that, for instance, that constantly recharges itself. When we were prepared today to talk about gang stats, but one of the challenges we have in the San Fernando Valley is that we have a number of our gangs that are recharging, if you will. They're recruiting, they're actively engaging new gang members. There's people in Blythe Street today that were probably 2 or 3 years of age when the gang injunction in Blythe Street was initiated in 1994. Now, the reality of that is that that's a failure in the sense that we haven't been able to remove Blythe Street's as a gang, its influence in that neighborhood.
15 years old.
But yet at the same time, I think it's a success because we have been able to greatly diminish the influence of that because of, and we talked about this at the town hall, the immediate ability to stop the bleeding, if you will, to actually address the immediate apparent influence of gang crime, but then begin immunizing or serving as a safety net, if you will, to stop the pathway of building that gang. Because again, and the powerfulness of an injunction is not the fact that it's a felony, because it's not. It's not the fact that it is some heavy hammer. It is a persistence that allows the police department to take action on low-level offenses, low-level associations that build into precursors, if you will, that build into acts of violence. We can take action regarding, as you know, a person shooting another individual. What we're trying to stop is the individuals loitering at the corner, exercising their dominance of that corner by their association when they're tagging, their intimidation of that neighborhood. By having an injunction allows us to stop that, to remove that target, if you will, of gang violence, or remove or initiate a contact and find out that they're in fact holding a weapon. We have to normally drive by those individuals. They haven't committed a crime. With an injunction, we can initiate a police action, we can initiate a detention, which allows us to also determine whether or not the person's armed. We otherwise would never have had that encounter, which means that those gang members, we've stopped early on. We've interrupted an act of violence. So the lasting aspect of this is, when does it go away? In my mind, when I look to the Van Nuys community and say, is the Blythe Street injunction still necessary? At this point, we still have a number of people we track through our ComStat process, through our inspections of our gang initiatives. What are you doing with the Blythe Street Injunction? It doesn't just sit up on a corner on a bookshelf and gather dust because it's some 10-plus years old. Instead, it's a relevant tool today as it was when it was initiated. It's different, though, today as to its impact in that community than it was when it was initiated. That in of itself also, in my mind, says success. So, but we can argue, there's people who argue that gang crime today.
So you're describing for me elements of success by the reduction of crime, certain elements of activity that were occurring before have diminished, yet at the same time, the city of Los Angeles has yet to experience what I would consider the ultimate success, where you look at it and you say, today,
right,
the commencement of an injunction in that neighborhood wouldn't be justified. Therefore, the fact that that neighborhood still has an injunction, is it time to trigger something that we've never done, which is to have an exit plan for gang injunctions. We've talked about an exit plan if somebody wants to petition as an individual to get off of a gang injunction, but we have yet to even embark on the discussion of when and if and how would we determine as a city that a neighborhood no longer, in other words, we lift that gang injunction?
The department, and I'll need to have the city attorney's office be allowed to respond, but the department there's a perception that we are opposed to an exit strategy for individuals on gang reductions. Let me be clear. There's nothing further from the truth.
Well, I just want to make it clear, I talk about the exit strategy a lot, and I've never accused the department of that.
No, I know that. And so, but I'm talking to the community that may be listening, okay, or to the advocates that are in opposition to this injunction because they believe that once this thing is formed, there is no exit strategy, that the department would find no such support. Well, that's very much an inaccurate perception. The department welcomes individuals that are going to leave the gang lifestyle. They're going to stop acts of violence. They're going to stop their engagement in this gang membership that causes these terrible outcomes, individually as well as to the community. Number two is we would welcome a strategy to identify a strategy that would allow an area to no longer be masked with the need for an injunction, just as we would welcome any strategy that allow us to stop all types of other social supports or controls or oversight of activities. Because I think that a society and a community that polices itself without government controls is a society that's better off. And so, just as a philosophy, the department does not welcome these injunctions as a forever matter. But at the same time, it recognizes with a clear eye that each of them in place today have a relevance because the gang itself that they've identified to address is a persistent problem.
May I follow up on that? Because, Council Member, you alluded to earlier accurately that you and I like to think Mr. Delgadillo as well initiated the conversation on exit strategy with regard to individuals a couple of years ago, that we picked up the ball big time in January 2007, and now here we are with a process that's launching. That said, what you're raising is a new idea, and it's an idea that has percolated around. This is the sunset idea, the next phase, the ultimate phase, where a neighborhood that was once dominated by a gang, and I absolutely will follow your very fair question to not get into specifics, but a neighborhood that was once dominated by a gang no longer is, and an injunction in that neighborhood could conceivably sunset. That's a phase that is, that's the final phase of a mission, if you think of it. That is a conversation that has a dialogue that LAPD has welcomed and does participate in at the command staff level. I can a chapter and verse cite that. I've been in those conversations. I know it's something that you're also looking towards, and City Attorney Delgadillo looks towards it because of his commitment to the community. It is a good subject to raise and start the discussion here. Where will it go? Where will that discussion go? It'll depend on the gangs. We know about the re-entry problem, as my colleague mentioned to me, and as you mentioned, what a big problem this re-entry problem is from prison. Are our prisons reducing the gang problem, or are gang members being hardened and created in our prisons? I have an opinion on that. It's probably a pretty dark opinion, but we do know that when these individuals come out, I know this for a fact, that people, I know it from a person saying it to me, that individuals that I have personally prosecuted, frankly, and still have a relationship with, which is just kind of what an odd thing about being a prosecutor, I guess, will get out of prison and they will indicate to me they got nowhere to go. This 5-10 years ago, particularly when there really was nowhere to go. What are they going to do? And the best advice I could give them was, well, whatever you do, don't go back to the neighborhood. Now, that's not a nice advice. It'd be nice in the world that was just described by both of you would be a much, much better world. You can go back to your neighborhood free and safe.
And it's a different neighborhood.
And it's a different
safer,
neighborhood.
And there's less elements to drag you back in, et cetera, et cetera.
But the best advice I could give that individual, those several individuals, was whatever you do, go anywhere, Vegas, Fresno, anywhere else in the city. Don't go back to the neighborhood because you'll be dragged in or the risk is too great. And I've seen the failures of those risks.
Because it's still on the list. They now have a record if they didn't already, et cetera, and the actions will be taken.
And let's be clear that when they go back, the rationale for that is that when they go back, they're going to be an OG that's coming back to the hood. And there's a taxing structure, there's a support structure, there's an expectation that they are going to be respected and that people are going to give them not just honor, but there's going to be a payola, if you will. This is not a boys' club. This is as you know, and so the essence of the continued, if this is a person afflicted with alcoholism, and they've received a successful treatment, and now they want to go out and hang back at the tavern because that's where all their friends are. A counselor would sit there and go, "What are you, nuts?" I mean, you're going to go back to the very same environment that got you here.
I think what you're describing is the fact of the matter is that what the city should be doing in complementing the improvement of public safety and the environment in and out of whether it's a gang reduction zone or whether it's a gang injunction area, et cetera, whatever that neighborhood is, without question, where it's a revolving, there's too much of a pattern of a revolving door of both activity, criminality, prosecution, et cetera, recidivism, if we don't address that community with multi-pronged efforts. Reentry, which is what you touched on, the need for reentry programs, prevention, intervention, and suppression.
Correct.
Well, I have one last question because I think I would probably have to institute a new rule that I have to buy you lunch if I keep you here for 3 hours testifying. Just really a point. Can the city attorney's office go to the San Diego and San Francisco website where they have quite a bit of information on their injunctions? They showed maps, the list of names, et cetera, obviously once the injunction is in place. And the reason why I say that is because I'd like you to come back to this committee, if you would, please, and let us know if in fact you've learned something from their sites or our sites are mirror theirs and or perhaps even have more information than they have. Let this committee know what you've learned from those sites and whether or not there's things that we could or should be implementing in this city on those kinds of websites. And in addition to that, I think it's important for people who are in gang injunction areas to be able to have an awareness that they are there, especially people who have teenage-age children whose neighbors might be gang members, and so that they can understand who their kids are associating with or not. And the fact of the matter is that on various levels, their children could be in very precarious positions if they are standing on a corner with two known gang members on an injunction. Their kid is not, although they're now of the same age of those other kids or what have you, and then all of a sudden a police officer pulls up, and then all of a sudden that could be an ugly scene for that kid who is sitting there saying, I'm 150 feet away from my house. This is my street. I'm not doing anything, et cetera. And all of a sudden that person didn't have enough awareness tools to be able to realize, I don't see anything wrong with these guys. They've never done anything to me, right? I'm just talking to them. But at the same time, I think that those individuals and those families and those neighborhoods need to be able to have as many tools as possible so they can make a conscious decision and a very informed decision about standing out on the corner, which is an innocent act if you're not a gang member, But if you are hanging out with a couple people who are in a gang injunction, it's going to be, it could end up being a pretty ugly scene for that person.
Just last night, Captain Joe Carreri attended a meeting at McClay Middle School, sponsored by McClay.
Where a couple of shootings occurred and at least one death. Right?
A death of a 15-year-old boy that was, or 14-year-old boy that was in the Pacoima area, an attendee at McClay, where the purpose of the 2-hour meeting was to discuss with parents that by the principal gangs, what it means to be in a gang, what some signs are the child might be going in that direction. Captain Carreri spoke as to the gang lifestyle, as to our efforts to solve that murder, but also there are senior leads within the department, our gang officers themselves that are educating. The department is also joins in that effort that no one would be tripped into a gang injunction, nor would anyone be tripped into unknowingly in violation of a gang. So we would always communication needs to be done. We won't argue with that. We believe, though, that today that each of the areas, Canoga Park or Langdon, Blythe Street, that those neighborhoods are well aware through existing channels, but we would welcome also added communication opportunities.
And if I may, and I don't mean to belabor it, but your question again, I frankly applaud you for underlining something that we're already talking about, but we'll work with you and consult with you on this website issue and the communication issue. I think you'll see, Council Member, not only will we respond, we'll embrace that response, and I think you'll see a bit of a revolution with the City Attorney of Los Angeles' website with regard to gang injunction information, where we want that information where it's publicly appropriate to get out. That kind of private information about individuals that sure people in the community would love to know, that might not be appropriate, and we won't do anything like that. But on the big issues, yes.
Think you can get back to this community in another 30 days so we can discuss that topic?
I think so. 30 days, and I'll work with your staff. And if I may also note, I really want to, two things, if Councilman, I think you'll find them appropriate. One, by the way, the work you started with us to get this petition going and this process, we have gone on and shared that with the San Francisco City Attorney and worked with them, and they now have that process. And they would tell you if they were sitting here, that was because of interactions with myself and others in the office. In Orange County, they are incorporating a similar petition process. And I believe in Ventura they're looking at it. But I know in Orange County and in San Francisco, the work that you started, as I say, with Mr. Delgadillo is spreading. And I wanted you to know that. And that started here. And I think you have this.
And just like they're learning from us, I want to find out how much we can learn from them.
Took the words out of my mouth.
If we don't have to reinvent the wheel in some aspects, well, why should we do that?
We will go to that website, we'll look at it, and as a last note, I always note this if I remember, because I often forget. The Human Relations Committee also works very hard and attends a lot of these meetings and helps us and guides us a lot. Sometimes it's forgotten to mention, and I'm the person maybe most likely to forget. I just want to note that they're really part of this process too.
Good. I understand that as well. Thank you for noting that. Now we'll move to public. Thank you, gentlemen, very, very much.
Thank you, sir.
Now we move to public comment. Our first public comment card comes from Peter Biebring. Biebring. Thank you.
I'm going to take my water.
Sure.
And Councilmember, I may briefly step out. Just
sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember. Peter Biebring from the ACLU of Southern California. It's difficult to respond to everything that's been discussed in the past 2+ hours in 2 minutes, but I'll focus on ACLU's concern about gang injunctions as an overly broad tool. ACLU...
Put the mic a little closer to yourself.
The ACLU, like everybody else in the city, is concerned with gang violence and its effect on communities and families in the city. But gang injunctions, we strongly believe, are an overly broad tool that inflict collateral damage on communities, families, and individuals who live in neighborhoods that are affected by gangs, who may have gang members as their neighbors, family members, but who are not themselves in gangs. And this often is low-income communities of color. The prohibitions of gang injunctions are incredibly broad, and I think it bears emphasis that many of them are non-criminal activities, simply associating with other individuals, standing on a street corner, being out past a certain time at night. And there are no exceptions made for association of two members named on a gang injunction if they're at a jobs program, if they're at a gang rehabilitation program, if they're taking advantage of the city's prevention efforts at a park, they are nonetheless violating the gang injunction and subject to jail time. The injunctions leave an incredible amount of discretion to police officers to, once it's in place, to serve whoever they believe are gang members with little intervention by a court. By the time a court actually addresses whether somebody is a gang member, they have already been arrested for a potential violation and probably spent some time in jail and have probably are more likely to plead to a time served for a violation than face potentially 180 days in jail. No one has ever gotten off a gang injunction in the city yet, and one thing we agree with the department that this is not the only tool to fight gang injunctions. There are already many laws in place to fight criminal activities that we believe should be enforced before injunctions are instituted.
Okay, thank you. Kim McGill? Thank you.
So I know this is going to feel rushed, and I appreciate the opportunity to do public comment. We have several concerns with gang injunctions generally, but especially with what's being discussed today. First is we want to emphasize that this draws an incredibly wide net. We think it'll be the largest geographic gang injunction ever in California. Definitely, we think it's the largest in LA County. So it really limits people's ability to seek employment, to seek other kind of resources in the community. Secondly, there's been a lot of testimony today as well as in the past about communities supporting gang injunctions. So we did surveys of 100 people in the Pico Union area, including senior citizens, business owners, business people that were coming there to go to work. 100 people in the Watts area, including Imperial Courts, where they were about to consider a gang injunction, as well as Nickerson Gardens and Jordan Downs, where they have them, as well as of the Watts Gang Task Force members. And when we asked people specifically whether or not they thought certain aspects of a gang injunction, like violating people, gang members, we said specifically in the survey, should gang members who are associating with other gang members be arrested? People said no. Should gang members who are out past 10 p.m. be arrested? People said no. When we asked the community as well as gang members themselves, should people be arrested if they're dealing drugs, carrying weapons, even gang members said yes, definitely. So we think that the community, when they talk about supporting gang injunctions, don't support them when they understand what gang injunctions mean. Finally, we think that there's a number of things that don't exist in this gang injunction, especially that set a really dangerous precedent for Los Angeles. In the past, people got served with a gang injunction. They had a period of time with which to show up in court, usually a month, and they could at least contest whether or not they belonged in that gang injunction. When you serve the entire gang, people lose that opportunity. Secondly, even when in the past, but certainly now also, if you do contest it because it's a civil court matter, you get no representation by a lawyer. So we really urge that people get legal representation when they try to challenge that initial serving. The city attorney's office, and we worked very hard on the exit also, have told us that people get to challenge their position on gang injunction when they're actually violated. But by then, people are already losing jobs, losing days at work, losing days in school, jeopardizing their financial aid because they're going back and forth to court on a criminal matter. And we don't think that's a legitimate place for people to be able to challenge their I guess, labeling as a gang member. There's a number of other things we'd like to say, too. We urge you to have the same 2-hour period for the community to respond to these issues as the city attorney's office and the LAPD gets.
Okay. You'll have that opportunity.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. There are no other public comment cards filled out for this committee. What we'll do, we'll hold this item in committee as anticipating bringing it back when we get the report back from the city attorney's office, and at that time we'll very likely agendize this matter, as there are a handful of questions that I didn't get a chance to ask. And in addition to that, as was requested by someone in the public comment period, that there be an opportunity for other people who have opinions and things to say about the gang injunctions to have an opportunity to have a longer period of time to speak. We always welcome that, and when that happens, I anticipate and would hope that not only the council members are listening, but also other officials in the city of Los Angeles who are involved in gang injunctions, such as the police department, city attorney's office, and the mayor's office. Okay? So with that, we don't have any more public comment cards on item number 1. Public comment on item number 1 is now closed. In addition to that, that concludes the items on the agenda. Is there anybody here for general public comment to this committee? Seeing and hearing none, general public comment is now closed. This committee is now adjourned.